My name is John Gates, and I've been a police officer with the San Francisco Police Department for a little over 11 years. Most of that time has been spent working nights. I have worked patrol in the Tenderloin, the Mission, the Richmond District, North Beach, and just about everywhere in between. If you've lived in San Francisco long enough, there's a decent chance I've driven down your street at 2 in the morning with my spotlight sweeping parked cars. People always ask me what the scariest part of the job is. They expect me to say the shootings, the armed robberies, the domestic calls where nobody knows who's waiting behind the front door. And those calls are dangerous. There's no question about that. You train for them, you stay alert, and you hope everyone goes home afterward. But they aren't the calls I still think about. The ones that stick with me are the reports that never made the news. The ones that didn't end with an arrest. The ones where nobody could explain what happened. San Francisco has always had stories. People talk about haunted hotels, abandoned tunnels beneath Chinatown, ghosts on Alcatraz, strange lights over the bay, and things that supposedly wander through the fog after midnight. Most officers laugh those stories off, especially when they're new. I did too. After enough years working nights, though, you start noticing that certain addresses keep showing up. Certain calls come in over and over, sometimes decades apart, with different witnesses describing the exact same thing. Dispatch usually has a perfectly ordinary explanation. By the end of the night, sometimes they don't. Now, I'm not saying everything I saw was supernatural. Most of it probably wasn't. People panic, they misidentify things. Fog can play tricks on you, and San Francisco gets plenty of it. But every once in a while, you come across a report that doesn't fit anywhere. No crime, no suspect, no evidence that explains what dozens of people swear they saw. Now, for obvious reasons, I'll be changing a few names. Some of these incidents are still tied to active files, and a couple of the people involved are still alive. The locations, though, those are real. So are the nights they happened. These are the 5 reports I still think about whenever the fog starts rolling in from the Pacific. Story 1. The Ghost Ship Beneath the Golden Gate. The first report happened during my 4th year with SFPD. It was late October, just after midnight, and the fog had already settled over most of the northern side of the city. San Francisco gets fog all year, but some nights it feels different. It hangs lower over the water, moves slower, and takes entire sections of the bay without warning. You can be standing at the Golden Gate Bridge and lose sight of the opposite tower in less than a minute. Officer Keith Freeman and I had just finished clearing a noise complaint in the Marina District when dispatch sent us toward the Golden Gate Overlook. At first it sounded routine. Multiple callers reported a disabled vessel near the bridge. The dispatcher added that the Coast Guard had already been notified, but wanted local units to help keep traffic from stopping along the overlook. That wasn't unusual. People stopped there for everything. Whales, fireworks, low-flying helicopters, a good sunset. We headed north, expecting to spend 15 minutes waving cars along before getting another call somewhere else. Instead, we found nearly 20 vehicles lined along the overlook with their hazard lights flashing. People were standing outside despite the cold. Nobody was talking very loudly. Most of them were simply staring out toward the bay. Keith stepped out of the cruiser first. "What have we got?" A middle-aged man wearing a Giants jacket pointed toward the fog. "Out there." I followed his finger. At first I didn't see anything, just gray. Then, a shape slowly emerged from the mist. It looked like an old cargo ship, not a modern container vessel. Something older. The hull sat unusually high in the water, and the bridge was positioned near the center instead of the stern. I couldn't make out much detail through the fog, but I could tell there weren't any navigation lights. No white mast light, no red and green sidelights. Nothing. Just a dark outline drifting across the bay. Keith frowned. "That's strange. It lose power?" I asked. The man beside us shook his head. "It hasn't made a sound." He was right. Even from that distance, we should have heard something. A diesel engine, a horn, the churn of water behind the propellers. Instead, The entire bay was quiet except for waves hitting the rocks below the overlook. Dispatch came back over the radio.
Unit 12, Coast Guard requesting visual confirmation.
Keith picked up the microphone. Affirmative. We have visual on a large vessel west of the bridge. No visible running lights. A few seconds later, another voice came across the radio. Not dispatch. Coast Guard.
Can you estimate heading?
Keith looked toward me. I studied the silhouette. Looks like eastbound, I said. Keith repeated it. The Coast Guard officer acknowledged the transmission, then went quiet. Several minutes passed. The ship continued drifting through the fog at the same slow pace. It never changed speed, never turned, never sounded a horn. A woman standing nearby asked if it was some kind of historical ship. Keith shrugged. Could be. I didn't think so. Even museum ships follow navigation rules, especially at night. I pulled out my phone and opened one of the public marine tracking websites I'd used before. Nothing. No vessel where we were looking. I refreshed it twice. Still nothing. That didn't necessarily mean much. Not every boat broadcast the same way. But something that size should have. A pair of Coast Guard vehicles arrived a few minutes later. 2 uniformed officers stepped out and joined us at the overlook. One of them introduced themselves as Melissa Hall. She looked through binoculars for several seconds without saying anything. Finally, she lowered them. You getting this too? Keith nodded. Yeah, I've been watching it about 10 minutes. She spoke quietly into her radio, requesting radar confirmation from their station. We waited. The ship continued drifting. Its outline became a little clearer as the fog shifted. The hull looked dark, almost black. And I noticed something else. There weren't any lights inside the bridge either. No glow from windows, no movement on deck, no crew, nothing. Just an empty-looking vessel moving through one of the busiest waterways on the west coast. Melissa's radio crackled. She listened for a moment, then asked them to repeat themselves. They've got nothing, she said. Keith looked over. What do you mean? No radar contact. He stared back toward the water. We're looking right at it. I know. Nobody spoke after that. Even the people who gathered along the overlook seemed to realize something wasn't adding up. One man tried recording the ship on his phone. Another asked if anyone else could hear an engine. Nobody answered. The fog began moving again. Not quickly, just enough for a long gray curtain to slide between us and the vessel. Within seconds, the outline disappeared completely. We kept watching, waiting for it to emerge again. It never did. The fog drifted past. Open water stretched beyond the bridge. No ship or wake. Nothing. Keith took a few steps toward the railing. Where'd it go? And nobody had an answer. Melissa immediately got back on her radio. The Coast Guard cutter already in the bay was redirected toward the last known position. Another unit checked from the opposite side of the bridge. But the water was empty. The people at the overlook slowly began leaving. Some looked confused. Others seemed disappointed, almost like the show had ended. Keith and I stayed another 20 minutes before being cleared from the scene. As we walked toward our cruiser, Melissa caught up with us. She looked older than I first thought, probably close to retirement. She rested her hands on the railing and looked out toward the bay. You know, she began quietly, my first captain told me about something like this. Keith smiled. What, a ghost ship? She didn't smile back. Well, he said every few years somebody reports an old freighter near the bridge. He told me the reports go back longer than I've been alive. You ever see it before tonight? I asked. She shook her head. And that was the end of our conversation. We finished our reports before sunrise. Now officially, the incident was logged as multiple callers reporting an unidentified vessel that could not be located by responding agencies. No emergency or missing ship, no follow-up investigation, just another report filed away. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I stopped by a Coast Guard office while dropping off paperwork and asked one of the civilian employees if there'd been any update. He searched the incident number. Nothing. Case closed. Before I left, an older employee who had overheard the conversation stopped me in the hallway. "You were there that night?" I nodded. He looked toward the window overlooking the bay. "My grandfather served out here after World War II. He told me that every so often, they'd get calls about the same ship." And then he picked up his coffee and walked away. Now, I've answered thousands of calls since then. Most of them blur together after enough years. But every time I drive across the Golden Gate Bridge on a foggy night, I still find myself looking for that ship. Story 2. The Girl Near Civic Center BART. The second report happened about 3 years after the incident near the Golden Gate. Unlike the first one, this started as a missing person. Dispatch put the call out just after 8:30 that evening. 19-year-old female, last seen leaving Civic Center BART after finishing work downtown. She texted her roommate that she was on the train home, but never arrived. By midnight, her phone had gone straight to voicemail. There was no activity on her bank account, no rideshare request, nothing. Missing adults aren't unusual in a city the size of San Francisco. Most turn up within a few hours. Sometimes they stay with friends. Sometimes they simply don't answer their phones. Still, something about this report felt different. Her backpack had been found near one of the station exits. Wallet inside, phone missing. Officer Cody Holmes and I were assigned to search the surrounding streets while transit officers worked inside the station. For the next 2 hours, we walked block after block around Civic Center. Alleys, parking garages, bus stops. Nothing. We stopped several people sleeping on sidewalks to see if they'd noticed anyone matching her description. Nobody had. Around 1 a.m, a BART supervisor approached us carrying a ring of keys. "These are a couple maintenance areas we haven't checked yet," he said. "They're normally locked." He led us through an employee-only hallway behind one of the platforms. The further we walked, the quieter everything became. Passenger announcements faded behind us. The crowds disappeared. Concrete walls stretched in both directions. Pipes ran along the ceiling. Water dripped somewhere farther down the tunnel. The supervisor unlocked a heavy metal gate. "Maintenance crews use this halfway." It ran beside one of the tracks, separated from the rails by only a few feet of concrete. He pointed down the tunnel. "Goes about 300 yards before another access point." We switched on our flashlights. The supervisor stayed behind the gate. "I'll wait here." The tunnel felt colder than the station above. Not freezing, but enough to notice. Our boots echoed against the concrete as we walked beside the tracks. Every sound carried farther underground. Water, footsteps, the low hum of electrical equipment. About 100 yards in, I stopped. Cody looked back. "What?" I didn't answer immediately. It felt like someone was standing behind us. I turned, but the tunnel was empty. Only the distant glow from the station entrance remained visible. "You hear something?" Cody asked. "No." We kept walking. Another 50 yards. The maintenance path curved slightly to the left, and that's when I looked farther down the tunnel. At first I thought they were workers. There were several figures standing near the opposite wall, too far away to make out clearly. Maybe 6, maybe 8, all about the same height. None of them moved. I raised my flashlight. The beam didn't reach that far. "Cody, you seeing that?" He squinted into the darkness. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The figures remained perfectly still. No flashlights or reflective vest. Nothing. I called out, "SFPD." No response. I tried again. "Hey, if you're maintenance, identify yourselves." Silence. Then, every one of them slowly turned their head toward us. For one brief second, I thought I saw several pairs of yellow eyes reflecting in the darkness. Not bright, just dull yellow points looking back at us. And then the sound of an approaching train rolled through the tunnel. The rails began vibrating beneath our feet, the tunnel filled with rushing air, and I instinctively stepped closer to the wall. The train roared past us, filling the entire passage with noise and wind. The lights flashed across the tunnel for only a moment. When the last car disappeared, the figures were gone. Every one of them. The tunnel ahead was empty. Cody shined his flashlight down the tracks. Neither of us said anything. We just continued searching. About 50 yards farther along, my flashlight caught something near the edge of the maintenance walkway. A white sneaker. I hurried forward. A young woman lay several feet below us in a recessed drainage area beside the tracks. She wasn't moving. Her breathing was shallow. There was dried blood near one side of her forehead. Cody. He was beside me immediately. Yeah, it's her. The drop was maybe 6 feet. I climbed down carefully while Cody radioed dispatch. She had a pulse. Strong. Her left ankle was swollen badly, and she had several cuts along her arms, but there were no obvious life-threatening injuries. I called her name. No response. A minute later, she groaned softly. Her eyes opened halfway before closing again. She seemed confused more than anything. Within minutes, we heard another train approaching from farther down the line. Transit control immediately stopped rail traffic once dispatch confirmed our location. But hearing it echo toward us reinforced how close she'd been to the active tracks. With help from arriving firefighters, we lifted her back onto the maintenance walkway and carried her to the waiting ambulance. And she survived. A concussion, broken ankle, several bruised ribs. Doctors expected a full recovery. A detective interviewed her 2 days later. According to the report, she remembered leaving work, getting off the train, walking through the station, and after that, nothing. Nothing until waking up in the ambulance. Investigators reviewed every available security camera. They watched her exit the platform. She disappeared from one camera while turning a corner toward a service hallway. She never appeared on another. The hallway itself wasn't covered by surveillance. No one else matching her description entered after that. No suspicious person was ever identified. The case eventually stayed classified as an unexplained missing person with accidental injuries. Officially, she'd somehow entered a restricted maintenance area and fallen. That was the simplest explanation. Maybe it was even the correct one. I've read stranger reports that turned out to have perfectly ordinary answers. But every now and then, I think back to those figures standing in the tunnel. I asked Cody about them a few months later over coffee. I didn't mention the yellow eyes. I simply asked if he remembered seeing anyone down there. He looked at me for a second before answering. After the train passed, I figured I'd imagine that. Story 3. The Earthquake Rescue. The third report is different from the others because everybody remembers the day it happened. October 17th, 1989. If you lived anywhere around the Bay Area, you probably remember exactly where you were when the ground started moving. I wasn't a police officer yet. I was still in high school. The story came from John Keller, a retired SFPD officer I worked with during my first few years on the department. John had nearly 30 years on the job before he retired. He wasn't the kind of officer who exaggerated stories, and he almost never talked about old cases unless somebody asked. One night, we were sitting outside Central Station finishing paperwork when the conversation drifted toward earthquakes. Somebody asked him if 1989 had really been as bad as people said. He looked out toward the street for a few seconds before answering. Wasn't the shaking I remember? It was what came after, he said. John had been working day shift when the earthquake struck. At first, nobody understood how widespread the damage was. Radios filled with reports almost immediately. Collapsed buildings, broken gas lines, people trapped. Fires starting across different neighborhoods. Units were sent wherever they were needed. John's partner drove them toward a residential neighborhood filled with old Victorian homes. Most of the buildings were still standing. Some had shifted off their foundations. Others leaned at impossible angles without completely falling. One house near the end of the block had partially collapsed onto itself. The front porch had dropped several feet. One side of the second floor had folded inward. Neighbors were already outside, screaming that a family was still trapped. By the time John arrived, firefighters had begun organizing equipment. Nobody was rushing blindly inside. Everybody moved deliberately. One unstable wall coming down could kill everyone trying to help. The first hour was mostly preparation. Firefighters stabilized sections of the structure with heavy timber. Gas service was shut off. Electrical lines were checked. Police officers pushed curious neighbors farther back. John spent most of that time carrying equipment, medical bags, hydraulic tools, water, anything the firefighters requested. It wasn't exciting, it was exhausting. Dust covered everything. Every few minutes, someone stopped working long enough to listen. Sometimes they heard voices beneath the debris, sometimes they heard nothing. And then everyone started digging again. Well, eventually, firefighters located the first survivor, a little girl trapped beneath part of the staircase. She wasn't seriously injured, just terrified. John crawled partway through the opening while a firefighter kept loose debris from shifting overhead. The girl reached toward him without saying anything. He carried her back outside where paramedics immediately wrapped her in blankets despite the warm afternoon. Her mother was found less than an hour later, pinned beneath a collapsed doorway. Conscious, dehydrated, still talking. It took nearly 40 minutes to free her without causing more of the structure to collapse. By then, the sun had started getting lower. Aftershocks continued every so often, small enough that they usually caused no additional damage, large enough that everyone froze whenever the ground started vibrating again. Nobody spoke during those moments. They simply waited, then went back to work. A teenage boy was recovered next. He'd been trapped inside what remained of an upstairs bedroom. A broken arm, several cuts, otherwise incredibly lucky. Each successful rescue gave everybody a little more energy. If 3 people were alive, maybe everyone else was too. The father was located shortly after sunset. He'd been buried beneath part of the kitchen ceiling. Firefighters spent nearly an hour removing debris piece by piece before lifting him free. He had a broken leg and several cracked ribs, but still alive. John said the entire block applauded when paramedics wheeled him toward the ambulance. That left one person unaccounted for, the grandfather. According to family members, he'd been sitting in a downstairs living room watching television when the earthquake began. Nobody had seen him afterward. The search continued well into the evening. Portable lights illuminated the broken house. Generators hummed in the street. Firefighters worked carefully through every remaining section. Nobody wanted to rush, not after bringing 4 people out alive. John spent much of that time carrying smaller pieces of lumber away from search crews and helping keep pathways clear. There wasn't much talking anymore. Everybody was tired, covered in dust, moving because people still needed them to. About 3 hours after the search began, one firefighter called for silence. The entire scene stopped. Generators, voices, tools, everything. Someone thought they'd heard tapping beneath what remained of the front sitting room. The crews listened. Nothing. And then 3 faint knocks. Firefighters immediately marked the location and began removing debris by hand. John helped pass broken boards and bricks back through a growing line of responders. Nobody spoke louder than necessary, and every movement became slower, more careful. Nearly another hour passed before they reached the grandfather, and he had not survived. The collapse had trapped him almost instantly. The medical examiner later determined he likely died early during the earthquake. John said that was somehow comforting. The family didn't have to wonder whether he'd suffered for hours waiting to be found. By the time the body was respectfully removed, the scene had finally begun winding down. Paramedics left. Most of the neighbors returned to their homes. Firefighters started gathering equipment. Police remained behind to secure the property until engineers could inspect it the following morning. John volunteered to help make one final walkthrough with a fire captain, mostly to ensure nobody had accidentally been overlooked. The structure was eerily quiet now. Dust still drifted through flashlight beams. Broken picture frames covered the floors. Furniture lay scattered where the house had folded inward. They checked every room carefully. Kitchen, dining room, front parlor. Everything clear. When they reached the staircase, John noticed something that immediately made him stop. Footprints. Fresh, muddy footprints. They crossed the dusty hardwood floor toward the stairs. One set, bare feet, small enough to belong to a child. John frowned. He knew every surviving family member had already been accounted for. The little girl had been wearing shoes when she'd been rescued. These prints were barefoot. The fire captain noticed them too. "You expecting somebody?" John shook his head. The footprints climbed the stairs, and both men followed slowly. The upper hallway was empty. They checked every room again. Bedrooms, bathroom, closets. Nothing. No broken window, no attic access, no sign anyone had recently been there. The footprints simply ended near an upstairs bedroom doorway. Beyond that point, nothing. Just dust covering the floor exactly as it had been before. John searched the room twice. There wasn't anywhere for someone to hide. He finally walked back downstairs. The fire captain was still looking toward the staircase. "You see those?" John asked. The captain nodded. Neither man said anything for several seconds. Finally, John broke the silence. "You think somebody wandered in?" The captain looked at the footprints one last time before switching off his flashlight. I've worked fires, floods, earthquakes, and every major disaster gets reports like this." John waited for him to explain. He never did. Story 4. The apartment nobody lived in. Now, by the time I reached my 8th year with the department, I'd learned that certain addresses seemed to generate the same call over and over again. Not because they were dangerous, exactly. Because nobody could ever figure out what was happening. One of those addresses was an old apartment building in the Richmond district. It sat on a quiet residential street, only a few blocks from Golden Gate Park. 4 stories tall, built sometime in the 1920s, with faded cream-colored walls and narrow wooden staircases that creaked no matter how lightly you walked across them. The first call came in on a rainy Tuesday evening. Welfare check. Those are usually simple. A family member can't reach someone. A neighbor hasn't seen an elderly resident for several days. Most of the time, everything turns out fine. Dispatch told us multiple tenants had reported hearing someone inside apartment 4B. Furniture scraping across the floor. Heavy footsteps. Someone crying late at night. The problem was, according to the property manager, nobody lived there in years. Officer Cody Holmes was working with me that night. We parked in front of the building just after 10. Rainwater dripped steadily from the fire escapes. Several tenants were already waiting near the entrance. An older woman immediately walked toward us. "Oh, I'm glad you're here." "What's going on?" I asked. She pointed toward the upper floors. "It started again." "What started?" "The moving." She lowered her voice then. "Every night around 9. Another tenant joined the conversation then. "Yeah, you hear chairs sliding, the floor shakes, and somebody starts crying." He rubbed his arms despite wearing a jacket. "My bedroom, it's directly underneath." I asked whether anyone had actually seen somebody enter the apartment. Both shook their heads. The landlord arrived a few minutes later, carrying a ring of keys. His name was Keith. He apologized before we'd even gone upstairs. I know this sounds ridiculous." "You've checked the apartment?" I asked. "Dozens of times." "And?" "It's empty," he said. He led us to the 4th floor. Apartment 4B sat at the end of a narrow hallway. The paint around the doorway had yellowed with age. Dust covered the windows. Keith unlocked the deadbolt. I haven't rented this place since, probably 4 years ago." "Why not?" Too many people move out. They, hear things, he said. The door swung inward. The apartment was dark. Our flashlights swept across old hardwood floors, bare walls, empty rooms. Nothing. It looked exactly like an apartment waiting for renovation. Dust covered nearly every surface. The kind that builds up when a place sits untouched for months, maybe longer. Cody checked the kitchen while I moved toward the living room. Everything was exactly as Keith described. Empty. The fridge had been removed. Cabinets stood open. Even the light fixtures had been taken down. There wasn't anywhere for someone to hide. I called out anyway. SFPD. Only the rain answered. We searched the bedroom, bathroom, closets. Nothing. Keith leaned against the doorway. I told you. I was about to agree when Cody stopped walking. Hey, John. I looked over. He hadn't moved. His flashlight pointed toward the hardwood floor. At first I didn't understand what I was seeing, and then I walked closer. Footprints. Bare footprints. Dark with rainwater. Fresh enough that the edges hadn't begun drying. They started near the apartment's entrance, across the living room, headed toward the far wall. Nobody spoke. I crouched beside the nearest print. Definitely barefoot. Small. Maybe a woman's, teenager's. Not large enough to belong to either Keith or Cody. I reached out. Still damp. Cody looked toward Keith. You been in here today? Keith immediately shook his head. Nope. I stood and slowly followed the prints, one after another, perfectly spaced, like someone had calmly walked across the apartment only moments before we arrived. They crossed the center of the living room, and then stopped. Not faded or turned around, I mean stopped. The final footprint rested in the middle of the hardwood floor, and beyond it, nothing. I swept my flashlight across every corner again. Empty. Cody walked slowly around the room. Yeah, there's got to be another exit. But there wasn't. The windows were painted shut. The fire escape outside had rusted years earlier. The bathroom vent wasn't large enough for a person. Keith stared at the last footprint without saying anything. And we photographed everything, measured the prints, checked every inch of the apartment again, and nothing. Crime scene technicians even responded. They dusted fingerprints, collected moisture samples, examined the hallway. No usable evidence. The report eventually listed the incident as an unfounded welfare check. Possible trespasser unable to be identified. No property damage or victim. Case closed. I forgot about it, at least for a while. About 4 months later, Cody walked into the briefing room, holding a stack of reports. He tossed one onto my desk. Remember Richmond District? I looked down. Same address. Apartment 4B. Another welfare check. This time, a new tenant had rented the apartment after renovations. She called shortly before midnight. Reported hearing footsteps in her living room. Furniture sliding. Someone crying. Responding officers searched the apartment. Nobody found. I flipped another page. There were photographs attached. Bare footprints. Wet. Crossing the hardwood floor. Stopping in the middle of the room. Exactly where we'd found them months earlier. Well, I drove over the next morning before going home. The tenant was exhausted. Looked like she hadn't slept in days. I thought someone was breaking in. What happened? I asked. She pointed toward the living room. Well, I woke up because I heard somebody moving furniture. You have furniture? I asked. She laughed nervously. Yeah, that's the strange part. She only owned a couch. Nothing else heavy enough to drag across the floor. What about the crying? Her expression changed then. I heard a woman. It sounded like she was trying not to cry. I asked if she'd actually seen anyone. No, just the footprints. She refused to stay another night. Moved out before the week ended. Over the next few years, I saw that address come across dispatch several more times. Not often, maybe once every year or two. Always the same complaints. Footsteps, furniture moving, somebody crying. Sometimes responding officers found nothing at all. Sometimes they found fresh, wet footprints ending in the middle of the living room. The landlord eventually stopped trying to rent apartment 4B, and he just left it vacant. Story 5. The Call from Fort Point. The last report happened during my 10th year with SFPD on a cold night in January. The fog had settled over the northern waterfront before sunset. It never really lifted. By midnight, the Golden Gate Bridge looked like it was floating in the clouds. You could still see the lower portions of the towers if you were close enough, but the tops disappeared into solid gray. My partner, Cody Holmes, and I were finishing a traffic collision report near Fisherman's Wharf when dispatch interrupted us.
Possible jumper, Fort Point, multiple callers.
This wasn't the kind of call you took lightly. Fort Point sits directly beneath the southern end of the Golden Gate Bridge. During the day, it's full of tourists, photographers, and people walking along the shoreline. At night, it becomes almost empty. Just the sound of waves hitting the rocks and traffic rumbling overhead. Dispatch continued.
Callers report a female standing near the shoreline below the bridge.
Any description? I asked.
White jacket, dark hair, standing on the rocks facing the water.
No one reported seeing her climb over anything. Nobody reported hearing screams. She was simply standing there. Well, we arrived less than 6 minutes later. The parking lot was empty except for one parked sedan. The engine was cold. No one inside. The fog rolled across the shoreline in slow waves, hiding sections of the beach before revealing them again. Cody grabbed his flashlight. I'll check east. I'll head toward the rocks, I said. And we split up. The tide was low enough to expose a narrow strip of rocky shoreline beneath the bridge. My flashlight swept across driftwood, seaweed, and wet stone. Nothing. I called out, SFPD. Only the bridge answered. Traffic echoed high above me. A few gulls lifted from the shoreline before settling again farther down the beach. Dispatch came back over the radio.
Unit 12.
Go ahead.
We've received 3 additional calls.
Same description?
Affirmative.
They still see her. A pause.
They're saying she's standing perfectly still.
I looked up toward the overlook above Fort Point. There weren't any people there now, at least not that I could see. Where are the callers? I asked.
They're driving across the bridge.
So they're calling while moving? I asked.
Affirmative.
Every caller had seen the same woman while driving southbound across the Golden Gate Bridge, standing on the rocks, looking toward the Pacific. I searched another 20 minutes. Nothing. Cody checked the parking lot, nearby paths, and the old brick fort itself. Nothing. The Coast Guard confirmed nobody had entered the water. No witnesses remained on scene, no vehicles appeared abandoned, no signs of a struggle. We were about to clear the call when my flashlight landed on something tucked between 2 large rocks near the waterline. Flowers. A small bouquet, long dead. Only dried stems remained beneath faded plastic wrapping. Beside it rested a weathered photograph protected inside a cracked plastic sleeve. I carefully picked it up. The picture showed a young woman standing near the Golden Gate Bridge. Early 20s, dark hair, smiling toward the camera. There wasn't any writing on the back, just the photograph. Cody walked over. What'd you find? I handed it to him. He looked at the flowers. Memorial? Looks like it, I said. We searched the surrounding rocks. There were a few more old flowers scattered nearby. Some candles, small stones arranged into rough circles. Nothing unusual for a place where people occasionally leave memorials. Still, it felt oddly specific. The following afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I called the National Park Service office responsible for Fort Point. An older park ranger answered. He'd worked there for almost 30 years. I described the call, and before I finished, he quietly laughed.
You saw the flowers?
You know about them?
Yeah, they've been there in one form or another for years.
According to him, park rangers occasionally receive the same report, usually on foggy nights. Drivers crossing the bridge would call saying a woman was standing alone near the shoreline beneath Fort Point. By the time officers or rangers arrived, nobody would be there. That evening, I stopped by our records office before heading home, mostly because I wanted to know whether he was exaggerating. I searched incident reports tied to Fort Point. Possible jumper, welfare check, suspicious person. There were more than I expected. Different years and responding officers and witnesses. The descriptions hardly changed. Female, standing on shoreline, facing the water, not moving, unable to locate on arrival. One report dated back nearly 20 years, another almost 30. I even found one where the responding officer wrote that several motorists independently described the woman's clothing before arriving on scene. White jacket, dark hair, standing perfectly still. No subject located. Case closed. While I kept digging, there wasn't any missing persons case connected to the reports. No homicide or recovered remains. Nothing that tied everything together. Just dozens of nearly identical calls spread across decades. Eventually I asked one of the older detectives if he'd ever heard about them. He looked at the incident numbers, then nodded once. Fort Point? Yeah. He handed the folder back. I've been there twice. You find anybody? I asked. No. What do you think people are seeing? I continued. And he just shrugged. Well, the reports continued long after my first visit. Every so often, another one appeared. Another driver and witness. The descriptions never changed very much. Neither did the outcome. No body or arrest. No missing person connected to the scene. Just another report filed away beside the others. A few years later, I drove across the Golden Gate Bridge on my night off. Heavy fog, light traffic. And as I passed over Fort Point, I caught myself glancing down toward the shoreline, and for just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing near the rocks. By the time I reached the next opening in the fog, the shoreline was empty again. Maybe it had been driftwood, maybe it was a shadow, or maybe it was something else. Well, like I told you earlier, people usually assume police officers remember the biggest cases, the shootings, the hostage situations, the pursuits that end up on the evening news. The truth is, those calls mostly blend together. Every report follows the same process. You secure the scene, you interview witnesses, you collect evidence, you write your report. Eventually, someone higher up closes the case, and another file takes its place. That's how the job is supposed to work. It's the reports without answers that stay with you. The cargo ship that drifted through the fog without appearing on radar. The missing 19-year-old who somehow ended up beside active BART tracks after passing through a hallway where no cameras ever saw her leave. The old earthquake rescue where everyone was accounted for, except the muddy footprints leading into an empty second floor. The vacant apartment where wet footprints stopped in the middle of a room that hadn't been lived in for years. The woman beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, who dozens of strangers reported seeing over the course of decades, yet somehow never existed long enough for responding officers to find her. None of those reports solved anything. They just ended. Every one of them was filed away in a cabinet somewhere, case closed. No suspect or arrest or explanation. San Francisco has been through almost everything a city can survive. Earthquakes, major fires, shipwrecks, disappearances. More than a century of people arriving here hoping to start over. When enough history piles up in one place, strange stories tend to pile up with it. Most of them aren't true. Some grow larger every time they're told. But every once in a while, a report lands on your desk that refuses to fit anywhere. You read it once, then again. You talk to the officers who were there. You check the photographs, you go back to the scene, and nothing changes. I retired a few years ago. These days my nights are a lot quieter. But every now and then, when the fog starts rolling in off the bay, I'll find myself remembering the strange things I saw in San Francisco. My name is Jason Miller, and I work night search and rescue out of the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station in Yellowstone National Park. If you've ever driven through the north side of the park, you've probably passed our station without noticing it. It sits just off US Route 191, a few miles south of Gardner, tucked behind a gravel parking lot and a maintenance garage the size of a small warehouse. During the day, the place is busy. Rangers move in and out of the building, tourists stop to ask for maps, and parked trucks roll through the lot with coolers, radio gear, and toolboxes rattling in the back. At night, it's different. Most of the lights stay off, the front doors lock, and the only people still working are the rangers on the night rotation. That's where I come in. The night shift covers everything that happens in the park after most visitors have gone to sleep. Car accidents on Highway 89, injured hikers who stayed on the trail too long, campers who wander away from their sites after a few drinks and can't find their way back in the dark. A lot of the calls start the same way. Someone reports a missing person, or a vehicle sitting on the side of the road with the driver gone. Sometimes it's nothing. Someone takes a wrong turn, realizes their mistake, and walks back to the campground before we even get there. Other times, it's not nothing. Most nights, I work with one other ranger and a radio dispatcher inside the station. The trucks stay fueled and parked in a row beside the garage doors so we can get moving quickly. Each truck carries the same gear: trauma kits, rope bags, extra radios, thermal blankets, and floodlights that can turn a dark patch of forest into something that looks like a football stadium. When a call comes in, we grab the closest truck and we drive. If you've never been in Yellowstone after midnight, it's hard to explain how quiet the park gets. The main roads empty out. The campgrounds go dark, one by one. Even the animals seem to disappear for a while. The only sounds left are wind moving through the trees and the engine of the truck rolling along the road. That quiet is why the night shift exists. People underestimate how big Yellowstone really is. The park spreads across 3 states and more than 2 million acres of mountains, forest, rivers, and open valleys. Once the sun goes down, it becomes very easy for someone to step off a trail and disappear into that much wilderness. The official training manuals cover most of what we deal with: wildlife encounters, hypothermia, river crossings, how to organize a search grid when someone goes missing in rough terrain. I read all those manuals during my first week on the job. But there's another set of rules the manuals don't mention. I learned about those during my first night shift. The ranger who trained me was a guy named Kevin Derby. Kevin ran night operations out of the Tower Roosevelt Station and had been doing it longer than anybody else on the roster. On my first night, he walked me through the truck, showed me where the rescue gear was stored, and made sure I knew how to operate the radio system. After that, he handed me a cup of coffee and sat down across the table in the break room. "Before we start the shift," Kevin said, "there are a few things you should know." I assumed he meant the usual training stuff. Maybe certain trails where people got lost more often, or roads where tourists like to drive too fast at night. Instead, he gave me 6 rules. None of them were written down, none of them appeared in the training manuals, and every single one of them sounded ridiculous. One rule said if you saw a bear with glowing eyes, you were supposed to stay perfectly still. Another rule involved carrying green Tic Tacs during missing child searches. There was one about staircases in the woods that didn't make any sense at all. I remember laughing when he finished. Kevin didn't laugh. "Listen," he said, "you don't have to believe any of this. I didn't when I started either. But these rules exist because someone broke them once. He took a sip of coffee and looked out the window toward the dark trees behind the station. Some of those people, they didn't come back. I didn't know Kevin well enough at the time to tell if he was joking or trying to scare the new guy. Most ranger stations have their share of stories, and Yellowstone is full of old ones. People disappear in big wilderness areas sometimes. Happens in every national park. But Kevin didn't tell those rules like a ghost story. He told them like procedures. 3 years later, I worked the same night shift he trained me on. I've responded to enough calls along the roads and trails north of Tower Junction to know how quickly a normal search can turn into something else. I've seen enough strange things in the woods to stop laughing when someone mentions the rules. If you ever work nights out here, you'll hear them eventually. And if you're smart, you'll follow them. The first one is about bears. Rule 1. If you see a bear with glowing eyes, stay perfectly still. It can't see you if you don't move. The first time I saw the bear was about 6 months after I started working nights. Late September, the kind of cold night where the air feels dry and sharp in your lungs. I was riding with Kevin Derby that evening. We just finished checking a stalled vehicle along Highway 89 near Gardner, and we're heading back toward the Tower Roosevelt station. About 2 miles before the junction, the radio crackled.
Tower unit, possible animal disturbance at Bear Creek Campground.
The dispatcher began.
Campers reporting a large animal knocking over food lockers.
Kevin reached over and turned the radio volume down a little. That'll be a bear, he began. Happens every week. We turned off the highway and drove north along a narrow campground access road. The headlights swept across empty picnic tables, metal food lockers, and a few parked RVs with their lights turned off. Bear Creek Campground is small compared to most places in Yellowstone. Maybe 20 campsites, a restroom building, and a gravel loop road that circles through a patch of pine trees. Kevin shut off the truck engine when we reached the center of the loop. Let's check the lockers first, he said. We stepped out with flashlights. The cold air carried the smell of wet dirt and pine needles. Somewhere deeper in the campground, something metallic clanged. Kevin pointed his light toward the sound. Probably got in someone's cooler. We walked down the gravel road toward a row of food lockers near a picnic table. One of the metal doors was hanging open, and trash bags were scattered across the ground. Kevin crouched beside the mess and inspected the claw marks on the locker door. Big one, he said. And that's when I heard breathing. Slow and heavy. I turned my flashlight toward the road behind us. A bear stood about 30 yards away. At first, nothing about it seemed too unusual. It was a large black bear, maybe 6 feet tall when it lifted its head. Its fur looked wet along the shoulders, and its front legs were covered in mud. And then the eyes caught the light. They didn't reflect the beam the way animal eyes usually do. They glowed. Not bright, like a flashlight reflection. The color was dull and steady, like a green light buried deep inside the skull. The bear took a step forward. Kevin saw it the same moment I did. Don't move, he said. The words snapped something loose in my memory. Kevin had mentioned this exact situation during my first week on the job. At the time, I thought it was a joke. If you see a bear with glowing eyes, stay perfectly still. The bear walked closer. Each step landed with a soft crunch on the gravel road. Its head tilted slightly from side to side, as if it were listening instead of looking. Kevin stood completely still beside the food locker. I forced myself not to shift my weight. The bear stopped about 15 feet away. It lifted its nose and sniffed the air. The smell hit me. Wet fur mixed with something sour, like rotting meat. The bear stepped toward Kevin. and Kevin didn't move. It circled slowly, passing within a few feet of him. The green glow in its eyes stayed fixed on the space in front of him, but its head turned strangely as it walked, almost like it was trying to locate something by sound. And then my boot slid on the gravel. Wasn't a full step, just a tiny shift, and the bear's head snapped toward me instantly. Before I could react, it changed. The animal covered the distance in 2 seconds. Its claws scraped across the road as it lunged straight at the spot where the noise came from. I froze. The bear stopped just inches from me. Its nose hovered a few inches from my chest. Hot breath poured out of its mouth. I could see scars along the side of its muzzle and patches where the fur had fallen away. The glowing eyes stared straight ahead, not at me, at the space where the sound had been. I didn't move. Seconds passed, and then the bear turned its head slightly and sniffed again. Its ears twitched toward the trees at the edge of the campground. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest. The bear spun toward the sound and charged into the darkness. The trees shook for a moment as it crashed through the underbrush. And then everything went quiet again. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Kevin finally moved. "Now you know why the rule exists," he said. I turned toward him, still shaking. "That thing almost killed me." Kevin shook his head. "No, you almost killed yourself." He walked back toward the truck and gestured for me to follow. "That animal can't see the way normal bears do. It hunts by movement and sound." I climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. Kevin started the engine. "If you move, it finds you," he said. He pulled the truck back onto the campground road and drove slowly toward the highway. "And if you stay still, sometimes it doesn't." He glanced over at me once. "That's Rule 1. Rule 2. If you're searching for a missing child, bring green Tic Tacs. The first time I had to use that rule was the following spring. Early May, it's a strange time in Yellowstone. The snow starts melting in the valleys, the rivers run high, and the park begins filling with visitors again. Campgrounds reopen, the roads get busy, and the ranger station phones start ringing every hour with someone asking about weather, wildlife, or trail conditions. Most of those calls happen during the day. The bad ones, they usually come at night. The call came in a little after 9:30 p.m. I was sitting at the desk inside the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station finishing paperwork from a medical call earlier in the evening when the radio cracked alive.
"Tower unit, we've got a missing child at Pine Creek Campground."
The dispatcher sounded calm, but the words made the room feel colder. "Age?" Kevin Derby asked from across the road.
7 years old, male, name is Tyler Cooper. Last seen about 20 minutes ago near the restroom building.
Kevin stood up immediately. "All right," he said into the radio. "Notify park law enforcement and start logging units. We're on our way." He grabbed the truck keys from the hook beside the door and tossed them to me. "Let's move." We drove south along US Route 191 with the emergency lights flashing across the trees. Pine Creek Campground sits about 10 minutes from the Tower Roosevelt station, tucked into a narrow patch of forest beside a shallow stream. When we arrived, 2 park law enforcement trucks were already parked near the campground entrance. A small group of campers stood near the restroom building, talking in quiet voices. A woman was crying. Kevin shut off the engine and stepped out of the truck. A ranger from law enforcement walked over. "Parents say the kid was playing near their campsite," the ranger said. "They looked away for a minute and he was gone." Kevin nodded. "Is there a trail nearby?" "Yeah," the ranger said. "Lost Lake Trail starts about a quarter mile east." Kevin turned to me. Grab the searchlights and your radio. I stepped out of the truck and opened the rear compartment where the gear was stored. That's when Kevin reached into his jacket pocket and held something out to me. A small plastic box. Green Tic Tacs. I stared at it. You're serious? Kevin didn't smile. Take them. I slipped the box into my jacket pocket. Within 10 minutes, the search team had spread out across the campground area. Law enforcement covered the roads and parking lots, while Kevin and I headed toward the trail that ran behind the campsites. Lost Lake Trail begins with a narrow dirt path that winds through a patch of pine trees before climbing up toward the hills. Kevin stopped at the trailhead. All right, you take the trail side, I'll work the ridge. I nodded. We switched on our flashlights, and we moved into the woods. The trail followed the creek for the first 100 yards before splitting into two directions. I took the path that stayed close to the water. The beam of my flashlight bounced across rocks, tree trunks, and patches of wet dirt. Tyler, I called out. My voice disappeared into the trees. The only sound that came back was water moving slowly over stones in the creek. I kept walking. About 15 minutes into the search, the trail began narrowing as it curved around a small hill. The ground sloped downward toward the creek, and the trees grew thicker along the bank. I stopped and listened. Something moved above me. Wings. I tilted my flashlight upward. A crow sat on the wooden trail sign about 20 feet ahead of me. The bird watched me. It didn't fly away. I remembered Kevin mentioning the crow once during a conversation about missing persons. The Rangers had a nickname for it. They called it Tic Tac. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket, and I pulled out the small plastic box. The crow tilted its head at me. I opened the lid, and I shook a few of the green Tic Tacs into my hand, and then I crouched down and placed them on a flat rock beside the trail. The crow flew down immediately. It grabbed one of the candies in its beak, hopped back a step, and swallowed it. And then it looked at me. The bird lifted off the rock and flew deeper into the trees. I waited. About 20 feet ahead, it landed on a low branch and turned back toward me. I followed. The crow flew again. Each time it landed, it waited until I caught up before moving again. The bird guided me off the main trail and down a narrow slope that led toward a dry creek bed. The ground there was uneven and covered in fallen branches. And then my flashlight caught something blue. A jacket. I ran forward. A small boy lay on the ground beside a fallen tree trunk. His arms were wrapped around his stomach, and his face was pale under the beam of the flashlight. Tyler, I said. The boy didn't respond. I knelt down and felt his neck. Pulse, weak but steady. His lips were dry and cracked. The ground around him was scattered with pine needles and dirt, like he tried to crawl before collapsing. I grabbed my radio. Tower unit to command. I've located the missing child, alive but unresponsive. The coordinates near the creek bend east of Lost Lake Trail. The radio burst with replies as the other search teams moved toward my location. I looked back toward the trees. The crow was gone. Kevin reached me first with two other rangers carrying a stretcher. Nice work, he said, as we lifted the boy carefully onto it. The boy opened his eyes slightly as we carried him up the slope toward the trail. Later that night, after the boy had been taken to the medical clinic near Gardner, Kevin and I returned to the ranger station. I set the empty Tic Tac box on the desk. You want to explain that? I asked. Kevin picked up the box, then turned it over in his hands. Well, Tic Tac helps us find kids, he said. Why? Kevin shrugged. I have no idea. He set the box back on the desk. All I know is that the bird likes the green ones. Rule 3. If you see cats in the trees, do not turn your back to them. Back away slowly. I didn't believe that rule either the first time Kevin Derby mentioned it. At the time, it sounded like common sense advice about mountain lions. Yellowstone has plenty of them. And most rangers know the basics. Don't run, make yourself look bigger, maintain eye contact. But Kevin was very specific about one part. Don't turn your back. Not even for a second, he said. The way he said it made it sound less like wildlife advice and more like survival instructions. I learned why a few months later. It was late August, near the end of the busy season, when the park still had tourists, but the nights were starting to cool down. Kevin had the night off that evening, so I was paired with another ranger named Adam Turner. Adam worked days most of the year and only picked up night shifts when the schedule got thin. Around midnight, the radio dispatcher called in a report from a group of hikers who'd returned late from Bear Ridge Trail. They said they heard something moving in the trees above the trail while they were hiking out. They didn't see what it was, but they said branches kept shaking over their heads the whole way down. Adam grabbed the keys to the truck. It's probably a mountain lion, he said. We drove east along US Route 191 for a few minutes before turning onto the gravel access road that leads toward Bear Ridge Trail. The road runs along a stretch of forest where the trees grow thick and close together, blocking most of the moonlight. Adam parked the truck near the trailhead sign. You ready? He asked. I grabbed my flashlight and radio. We stepped onto the trail. Bear Ridge Trail climbs gradually into the hills east of the road. The path starts wide enough for two people to walk side by side, but after a few hundred yards, it narrows to a single track that winds between tall pine trees. The only sounds were our boots crunching on dirt and the wind moving through the branches above us. About 5 minutes into the hike, Adam stopped. Did you hear that? I listened. Something moved in the trees, not on the ground. Above us, a branch shifted somewhere to our left. Then another branch moved farther ahead. I tilted my flashlight upward. 2 glowing eyes stared back at me from a thick branch about 20 feet above the trail. The shape behind the eyes looked like a mountain lion. And then another pair of eyes appeared on a different branch. And another. 3 cats sat in the trees above the trail. And all of them were watching us. Adam stepped backward. That's weird. Mountain lions don't usually travel in groups. One of the cats shifted its weight and moved along the branch. The movement was smooth and silent. Its body stretched across the limb like it'd been there for hours. Another cat climbed down slightly from its branch and crouched lower. Adam turned his flashlight toward it. That one's big. The animal was easily larger than any mountain lion I had seen before. The beam of my flashlight moved across the trees. More eyes appeared. 4, then 5. The cats were spread out across the branches above the trail, all facing the same direction. Toward us. Adam took another step backward. I think we should get back to the truck, he said. That's fine, I said. Just don't turn around. He looked at me. What? Don't turn your back, I said. Adam shifted his weight again. Why? But before I could answer, one of the cats moved. It didn't jump down. It walked along the branch above us, staying directly over the trail. The others followed. The cats were tracking our movement from above. Okay, Adam began. That's not normal. We started backing down the trail together. Our flashlight stayed pointed upward as we moved. The cats continued pacing along the branches, moving tree to tree above us. One of them dropped lower on the trunk of a pine tree until it was only about 10 feet above the ground. Adam stopped. "That thing's following us," he said. "Keep backing up," I told him. We moved slowly down the trail for another 30 yards. And then Adam made a mistake. He turned his head slightly and glanced behind him toward the direction of the truck. And one of the cats dropped from the branch instantly. The animal landed on the trail behind us with a heavy thud. Adam spun around. "Don't run," I said. The cat crouched low on the dirt path. Its tail flicked slowly behind it. The muscles in its shoulders tightened like it was preparing to jump. Adam froze. The other cats stopped moving in the trees above us, and everything went quiet. I slowly reached for the flashlight mounted on my belt and clicked it on. The second beam of light hit the cat directly in the face. It blinked once, and then it turned and leaped back into the trees. Within seconds, the rest of the cats disappeared into the darkness above the trail. Adam and I stood there for a moment listening. Nothing moved. We backed the rest of the way down the trail and reached the truck without saying another word. Adam didn't speak until we were halfway back to the ranger station. "How many were there?" "I counted 5, I said. He stared out the window at the dark forest passing by. "Mountain lions, they don't hunt like that." "No, they don't," I said. When we reached the station, Kevin was sitting at the desk finishing paperwork from another call. He looked up as we walked in. "You guys run into something?" he asked. Adam nodded slowly. "Cats," he said. Rule 4. If you hear dead relatives over the radio, turn the radio off and don't look outside for the rest of the night. The first time that rule mattered, I was alone at the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station. Kevin had taken a day off, and Adam Turner was working a different district that night. That left me covering the radio desk and the truck bay until morning. Nights like that happen a few times every season, when schedules overlap or somebody calls out sick. The station sits just off US Route 191, north of the Lamar Valley area. After midnight, there's almost no traffic on that stretch of road. Occasionally a car passes, heading toward Gardner, but most nights the only vehicles moving through that part of the park belong to rangers or park maintenance crews. That night, a storm had moved through earlier in the evening. By the time midnight came around, the snow had stopped, but a thin layer still covered the ground outside the station. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the trucks parked beside the garage. Inside the building, everything was quiet. I sat at the radio desk finishing a report from a minor vehicle accident that had happened earlier along Highway 89. The heater hummed softly in the corner of the room. The radio stayed silent for nearly an hour, and then it clicked. First, I assumed it was just static. Radios in the park pick up strange interference sometimes, especially during bad weather. The speaker crackled once and then went quiet again. I kept writing. A few seconds later, the speaker clicked again.
"Jason?"
The voice was clear. It came through the radio speaker like a normal transmission. I froze.
Jason, you there?"
The voice belonged to my brother, Mark Miller. He died in a car accident 4 years before I ever started working in Yellowstone. For a moment, I just stared at the radio.
"Jason?"
The voice said again. The transmission sounded slightly distorted, like someone speaking through a weak signal.
"I'm outside.
The voice continued.
Can you open the door?"
My eyes moved toward the front window of the station. Snow covered the ground outside the building. The porch light illuminated the wooden steps leading up to the entrance. The trees behind the station swayed slightly in the wind. No one stood on the porch. The radio clicked again.
"Jason, I'm freezing out here."
The voice sounded exactly like him. Same tone, same rhythm in the way he spoke. For a moment, my chair scraped against the floor as I started to stand. And then something Kevin Derby had said months earlier surfaced in my head. If you hear a dead relative over the radio, turn it off and don't look outside. The radio crackled again.
Jason, I know you can hear me.
My hand moved toward the radio controls. The voice sounded closer this time, almost impatient.
Just open the door.
I shut the radio off. The room fell silent instantly. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and then I heard footsteps outside. They moved slowly across the wooden porch. The sound traveled along the front wall of the station toward the window beside the desk. I kept my eyes on the paperwork in front of me. Another step. Something stopped just outside the glass. I could feel a presence on the other side of the window without looking up. The porch light still cast shadows across the snow outside, but I refused to turn my head. The footsteps moved again. They circled the building slowly. Snow crunched beneath heavy weight as whatever was outside walked past the window, along the wall, and around the back of the ranger station. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes. The heater continued humming beside the desk. Outside, the footsteps moved around the building again. The sound passed the window a second time, then a third. Eventually, the noises stopped. I didn't move from the chair until the sky outside the window began turning gray with the early morning light. When the sun rose above the tree line, I finally stood and walked toward the door. I opened it slowly, and cold air rushed inside. The snow around the ranger station was covered in tracks. Large footprints circled the entire building. Each print was deep enough to show the shape clearly. They were human, but they were far too large to belong to any person. The track stopped directly in front of the door, right where the voice had said it was standing. Rule 5. If you see a staircase in the woods, burn it. I didn't see the staircase until my second year working nights in Yellowstone. By then I'd already dealt with the bear, the cats, and the radio incident. Those things had taught me that Kevin Derby's rules existed for a reason. I still didn't understand them all, but I'd stopped arguing about them. The staircase showed up during a missing hiker search. The call came in just after 11 p.m. A man named Daniel Foster had failed to return from a solo hike along Lost Lake Trail. His truck was still parked at the trailhead, and his campsite at Pine Creek Campground was empty. Several teams had already been working the area for several hours when Kevin and I arrived. 2 law enforcement rangers were checking the lower part of the trail, while a volunteer team worked the ridge above the creek. Kevin decided we would search the stretch of forest that runs between the trail and an old fire road farther east. We parked the truck near the trailhead, and we grabbed our gear. "Stick close," Kevin said as we stepped into the trees. The forest around Lost Lake Trail is dense, even during the day. At night, the branches block most of the moonlight, leaving only narrow beams from our flashlights cutting through the dark. We followed a faint path running parallel to the main trail. The ground was soft with pine needles and patches of wet soil. Somewhere nearby, water moved slowly through the creek. For the first 20 minutes, we didn't find anything. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign the missing hiker had passed through the area. Kevin stopped near a cluster of large rocks. "Let's cut east," he began. "That fire road should be about 100 yards that way." We turned off the faint path and started moving through thicker trees. Fallen branches snapped under our boots as we pushed deeper into the forest. And then my flashlight hit something that didn't belong there. Wood. Straight lines. I stopped walking. Kevin?" He turned and followed the beam of my flashlight. A staircase stood in the middle of the woods. It was made of dark wood, maybe 10 steps tall, with narrow railings on both sides. The structure looked old but intact, like it'd been part of a house or a cabin at some point. Except there was no house, no walls, no foundation. Just a staircase rising out of the dirt. Kevin walked closer and shined his flashlight along the steps. The wood looked dry and weathered, but the edges were clean. No rot, no broken boards. "How does that even get here?" I asked. Kevin didn't answer. He walked around the staircase slowly, inspecting the ground near the base. There were no tracks, no tire marks, no debris from a collapsed building. Nothing. "Don't touch it," Kevin said. I stepped back. He reached into his radio pouch and switched channels. "Command, this is Tower Unit," he began. "We're shifting the search east of Lost Lake Trail. Possible structure located in the woods." The dispatcher acknowledged the message. Kevin clipped the radio back onto his jacket and looked at the staircase again. "We're burning it." I blinked. "What?" Kevin pointed toward the truck. "Gas cans in the back compartment." "You're serious?" "Yes." I jogged back toward the direction of the trail until the beam of the truck's headlights appeared through the trees. The gas can sat exactly where Kevin said it would be, beside the spare batteries and rope bags. I carried it back through the forest. Kevin was still standing near the staircase when I returned. He took the gas can and began pouring fuel across the wooden steps. The liquid soaked into the boards and dripped onto the dirt below. "Any idea what this is?" I asked. Kevin shook his head. "All I know is that we don't leave him standing." He handed the can back to me. "Step away." I moved several yards back through the trees. Kevin pulled a lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. For a moment, the flame illuminated the staircase clearly, and then he dropped the lighter onto the fuel-soaked wood. The fire spread instantly. Orange flames climbed the steps and wrapped around the railings. The dry wood cracked loudly as the heat intensified. I heard something move in the forest behind us then. A branch snapped, then another. Kevin didn't turn toward the sound. "Stay focused," he said. The staircase burned hotter as the flames climbed higher. Smoke drifted upward through the branches overhead. Something heavy moved through the trees again, closer this time. I turned my flashlight toward the noise. The beam caught nothing but trunks and leaves. The fire consumed the steps one by one. Boards collapsed inward as the structure weakened. And eventually the entire staircase fell apart. The last pieces burned down to glowing embers scattered across the ground. The forest went quiet again. Kevin kicked dirt across the remaining flames until only smoke remained. We stood there for a moment listening. Nothing moved in the trees. Kevin finally turned toward the direction of the trail. "All right, let's get back to the search." Well, we found Daniel Foster about an hour later, sitting beside the creek a half-mile away. He'd twisted his ankle and couldn't walk back to the trail on his own. As we helped him out of the stretcher, I glanced once toward the dark forest where the staircase had stood. Nothing was there anymore. Just trees and dirt. Rule 6. If you take a picture and there's a person in it you don't remember seeing, burn the photo. Things can come alive through photos. The photo incident happened last fall. By that point, I'd been working nights out of the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station for almost 3 years. I'd seen enough strange things in the park to stop questioning Kevin's rules. I didn't always understand them, but I followed him. The call that night started like a normal search. A couple reported hearing someone yelling near Bear Ridge Trail just after sunset. They said the voice sounded like it was coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere off the trail. When they tried to follow the sound, it stopped. Kevin and I drove out to the trailhead along US Route 191 and parked the trail near the entrance sign. Probably someone just messing around in the trees, Kevin said. We grabbed our radios and flashlights and started walking the trail. Bear Ridge Trail runs through a narrow stretch of forest before climbing toward a rocky overlook that faces the valley. The lower section of the trail stays mostly flat and winds through thick pine trees. About 10 minutes into the search, Kevin stopped. "Take some photos," he said. "For what?" "For the report," he replied. "We document this area whenever we check a location like this." I pulled my phone out and turned on the camera. The flash lit up the trees ahead of us. I took a photo of the trail marker, then another of the surrounding woods. Kevin walked a few yards ahead and scanned the ground with his flashlight, while I took 2 more pictures showing the direction of the trail and the nearby trees. We didn't find anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had actually been yelling in that area. Kevin shrugged. "Probably someone down in the valley," he said. We walked back to the truck and drove to the next area the dispatcher wanted us to check. By the time we returned to the ranger station, it was close to 2 in the morning. Kevin went to the break room to grab coffee, while I sat down at the desk to start writing the incident report. Part of that process involved uploading any photos taken during the search. I opened the camera roll on my phone. The first photo showed the trail marker exactly the way I remembered it. The second photo showed the trees beside the trail. But the third photo made me pause. Someone stood in the background. The figure was partially hidden behind a pine tree, about 20 feet behind Kevin. I leaned closer to the screen. The man wore dark clothing and stood completely still. His face looked pale. I knew immediately that he had not been there when I took the photo. I would have seen him. Kevin walked back into the room carrying his coffee mug. "You finished the report yet?" "Look at this," I said. He stepped beside the desk and looked down at the phone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. And then he set the mug down slowly. "Scroll," he said. I swiped to the next photo. The same trail appeared on the screen, the same trees, the same spot behind Kevin. The man was closer now. He stood fully in the open now, facing the camera. Kevin grabbed the phone from my hand then. "Stop," he said. He walked to the printer beside the desk and connected the phone with the cable. Within seconds, the printer spit out the photo onto a sheet of paper. Kevin carried the printout outside behind the ranger station, where an old metal burn barrel sat beside the maintenance shed. He dropped the photo inside and struck a match. The paper curled as the flames spread across the image. For a moment, the man's face burned orange in the firelight, and then the photo turned to ash. Kevin watched the barrel for a few seconds before walking back toward the station. When I checked my phone again, the photo was gone. The camera roll jumped from the second picture straight to the fifth. The man had disappeared. Kevin picked up his coffee mug and sat back down at the desk. "Sometimes things notice you through pictures." And that was all Kevin told me. Now, most people think the dangerous part of Yellowstone happens during the day. They think about grizzly bears on hiking trails, tourists getting too close to bison, or someone slipping near one of the hot springs. The Park Service posts warning signs everywhere about those things. Rangers give safety talks. Visitors read pamphlets before heading out onto the trails. Those dangers are real. But night is different. When the sun drops behind the mountains, most of the park shuts down. Campground lights turn off. Visitor centers close. The roads empty out except for the occasional car heading toward Gardner or deeper into Yellowstone National Park. And that's when the night shift starts. The Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station stays open 24 hours a day, even when everything else goes quiet. Someone always monitors the radio. Someone always keeps a truck ready to roll if a call comes in. Sometimes those calls are normal. A driver hits a deer on Highway 89 and needs help getting off the road. A camper twists an ankle on Lost Lake Trail and can't walk back to the parking lot. A group of hikers misreads a map and ends up on the wrong trail after sunset. We handle those situations the way any search and rescue team would. We grab our gear, follow the trail, and bring back people safely. But the night rangers also deal with the other things. The things Kevin Derby warned me about during my night shift. Over the years, I've learned that those rules don't exist because someone thought they sounded interesting. Every one of them started with an incident report somewhere in the park's history. A ranger who moved when the bear got close. A search team that ignored the crow. Someone who ran when the cats came down from the trees. Someone who opened the door when the dead voice called from outside. Someone who climbed the staircase. Someone who kept the photograph. The details of those reports don't always make it into the official reports. Sometimes the paperwork just says a ranger went missing during a search or failed to return from patrol. But the people who work nights in Yellowstone, we know the rest of the story. Kevin Derby still runs the night shift most weeks. I've seen him give the same talk to new rangers that he gave me years ago. He sits across the table in the break room with a cup of coffee and explains the rules one at a time. Most of them laugh the first time they hear it. I did. And then they work a few night shifts in the park. And eventually something happens. Maybe they hear a voice on the radio that shouldn't be there. Maybe they notice something moving in the trees above a trail. Maybe they find a staircase where no building has ever stood. After that, they stop laughing. Yellowstone. It's one of the largest national parks in the U.S. Millions of visitors drive through it every year. They take photos, hike the trails, and watch wildlife in the valleys during the day. Most of them leave before the park gets truly dark. The few who stay overnight usually fall asleep inside their tents or RVs without realizing just how quiet the forest becomes around them. That quiet is when the night rangers start paying attention, because the wilderness doesn't belong to us after dark. We just patrol it. My name is Randy Cruz, and I've worked search and rescue in Appalachia for a little over 18 years. Most people have a very different idea of what this job looks like. They picture helicopters flying through storms, teams racing through the woods in the middle of the night, dangerous rescues hanging from ropes along the side of cliffs. That stuff does happen, but not as nearly as often as people think. Most of the job is less exciting. A hiker twists an ankle 3 miles from the nearest road. An elderly man with dementia wanders away from his property. A hunter loses his bearings after dark and spends the night walking in circles. These are the calls we get most often. The good news is that we usually find those people. Sometimes they're embarrassed or cold or injured, but most of the time they go home. Now, the mountains can be dangerous, but they aren't trying to kill anyone. At least that's what I believed when I first started. Back then, I was 24 years old and convinced I had one of the best jobs in the world. I grew up in Appalachia. The mountains never scared me. I spent my childhood hiking trails, fishing creeks, exploring old logging roads, and getting into places my parents would have killed me for visiting. By the time I joined search and rescue, I felt like I knew those mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. And I quickly learned I was wrong. Appalachia, it's huge. Most people don't realize just how large it is until they see it for themselves. The mountain range stretches across multiple states. Thousands of square miles of forest cover the region. There are valleys that haven't changed much in 100 years. There are abandoned mines, forgotten homesteads, old cemeteries, and cave systems that go deeper underground than most people would ever willingly follow. You can spend your entire life here and still discover places you have never seen before. That's one of the reasons people disappear. The mountains don't have to do anything strange. All it takes is one wrong turn, one bad decision, one storm arriving earlier than expected, one missed trail marker. After that, things can go downhill very quickly. Over the years, I've searched for hundreds of people. In some cases lasted an hour, weeks, a few lasted months. Most of them had normal explanations. A person got lost or injured or panicked. Case closed. But every once in a while, we'd come across something that didn't fit neatly into a report. Something that made experienced people stop talking for a moment. Something that stayed with you long after the search ended. I'm not talking about monsters or ghosts, and I'm definitely not talking about internet stories. The 5 cases I'm about to tell you all came from actual searches I worked during my career. Now, before anyone starts drawing conclusions, I'm not claiming I know what happened in any of them. I don't. In every story, there are details that could probably be explained if someone had enough information. The problem is that we never found enough information. That's what makes these cases different. Most search and rescue operations end with answers. These didn't. Some ended with evidence that made no sense. Some ended with witnesses who all reported the same thing. Some ended with discoveries that still bother me years later. I still have copies of the reports. I still remember the names. And in a few cases, I still remember exactly where I was standing when things stopped making sense. The first story, it happened about 12 years ago, started with a missing couple. At the time, nobody thought it was going to be unusual. The boyfriend and girlfriend had gone hiking near a remote cave system that sat several miles from the nearest road. When they didn't come home, their families reported them missing. Search teams were assembled, maps were checked, volunteers arrived. Everything about the situation looked routine, at least in the beginning. Then we found the blood. And from that point forward, the search became something none of us ever forgot. The first story happened in October of 2014. At the time, I was working with a search and rescue unit based in eastern Tennessee. The area we covered included several state parks, large sections of national forest, and dozens of cave systems scattered throughout the mountains. Most of the caves were harmless if people stayed near the entrances. The problem was that people rarely did. Every year we'd get calls from hikers who wanted to explore somewhere they'd seen online or heard about from a friend. Most of them had no equipment, no maps, and no experience underground. Usually we found them. Sometimes we had to drag them out. And a few times we recovered bodies. That's why nobody thought much about the call when it first came in. A young couple had gone hiking near an old cave system known locally as Black Hollow Cave. The boyfriend was named Tyler Morgan. The girlfriend was named Emily Davis. Both were in their early 20s. According to their families, they planned a day hike and were supposed to be back before dark. When neither of them answered their phones that evening, relatives assumed they'd lost signal. The following morning, nobody had heard from them, and that's when the search started. I arrived at the command post shortly after sunrise. The weather was clear, visibility was good. We had volunteers, deputies, and 2 search dogs working the area. The couple's vehicle was found exactly where their family said it would be. A small trailhead parking lot roughly 3 miles from the cave entrance. Nothing looked unusual, no signs of foul play, no damaged vehicle, no indication they'd met anyone. Just an empty parking space surrounded by trees. Well, the first few hours went exactly as expected. Several teams searched the main trails, another group checked the cave entrance, a third team began working the surrounding ridges. Around noon, one of the volunteers located a water bottle. About 20 minutes later, Another volunteer found a light jacket. Both items were identified by the family. And at that point, we knew we were in the right area. The items formed a rough path leading toward Black Hollow Cave. That wasn't surprising. The cave was the main attraction in that part of the forest. Most missing hikers eventually ended up there. My team reached the cave entrance around 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't especially large, maybe 20 feet wide. The opening sat at the base of a limestone ridge, partially covered by moss and brush. A cool draft flowed out continuously, strong enough to feel from several yards away. Several members of our team entered the cave while others searched outside, and nothing was found. No backpacks or clothing, no footprints we could identify. No signs that anyone had gone deeper into the system. As the afternoon continued, our search area expanded. Around 4 o'clock, Anthony, Norton, and I were assigned to search a narrow ridge running south of the cave. The terrain there was rough. Loose rocks and dense trees, steep drop-offs. Not a place where people usually wandered unless they got lost. Well, we spent an hour moving through the area without finding anything. Then Anthony stopped. "Randy," he said. I walked over. He was pointing toward a rock about 10 feet away. At first I didn't see it, and then I noticed a dark stain. Blood. Not much, just a few drops. We marked the location and continued forward. About 20 yards later, we found more. Then more. The blood trail wasn't heavy. It looked more like someone walking while injured. A few drops here, a few drops there. Enough to follow. Not enough to explain. The discovery immediately changed the mood of the search. Lost hikers are one thing, injured hikers are another. Now everyone was moving faster. Additional personnel were sent to our position. The blood trail continued along the ridge for nearly half a mile. Sometimes it disappeared, then it would reappear farther ahead. Every time we thought we'd lost it, another drop would show up on a rock or patch of leaves. The trail eventually led us toward an area none of us expected. A cliff. The ridge ended abruptly. Beyond it was a steep ravine dropping several hundred feet. The view below was mostly trees, large boulders, and thick brush. Anthony was the first to reach the edge. I arrived a few seconds later. The last blood drops were sitting on a flat section of rock less than 3 feet from the drop. We searched the immediate area carefully. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, nothing. Just blood, then open air. I remember standing there staring over the edge, trying to make sense of it. If someone had fallen, there should have been evidence below. Broken limbs, damaged brush, something. Instead, everything looked completely untouched. Additional teams arrived shortly afterward. Ropes were brought in. Personnel descended into the ravine. Drones were deployed. The entire area below the cliff was searched before sunset. And nothing, no bodies or clothing, no backpacks, no signs that anybody had ever been there. The blood samples were collected and later confirmed to belong to one of the missing hikers, and that only made things stranger. We knew at least one of them had been injured. We knew the blood trail was real and it ended at the cliff. What we didn't know was where either person had gone. The search continued for 6 more days. More volunteers arrived. Additional dogs were brought in. Helicopters searched the surrounding forest. Nearby caves were checked again. Every possible route was examined, and nothing. No additional evidence was ever located. The couple's phones were never found. No backpacks, no bodies ever found. It was like they'd simply vanished. The official investigation remained open for years. Various theories were discussed. Maybe they became lost and wandered farther than expected. Maybe the blood trail belonged to an unrelated injury. Maybe somebody removed evidence before search teams arrived. Every explanation had problems. The biggest problem was the cliff. I still think about that location. I've returned there several times over the years. Not as part of a search, but I don't know why exactly. Every time I stand on that ridge, I found myself looking over the edge again, trying to see something I missed. trying to find a detail that would finally make the whole thing fit together, but never does. What especially bothers me is the blood trail, because blood trails are supposed to lead somewhere, to a body or campsite, an injured person, evidence, to answers. This one led to a cliff, and then it simply stopped. 12 years later, Tyler Morgan and Emily Davis remain missing. No bodies have ever been recovered, no suspects were ever identified, and no explanation has ever fully accounted for what we found on that ridge. Out of all the searches I've worked, I think this is the one I revisit the most. I still don't know what happened after those last few drops of blood reached the edge of that cliff. The second story took place during the summer of 2018. At first, nobody connected the incidents. The reports came from different areas of the county and were spread out over nearly 2 weeks. Individually, none of them sounded especially unusual. Farmers occasionally found dead livestock. Deer sometimes died from disease or injury. People reported seeing strange animals in the mountains all the time. Most of those reports turned out to be nothing. This one didn't. The first call came from a property owner who lived near a cave system, about 20 miles north of where I was stationed. He discovered 2 dead goats early one morning while checking his fencing. Predators weren't unusual in that area. Black bears, coyotes, bobcats, and wild dogs all occasionally caused problems for livestock owners. Normally, when one of those animals attacked, the evidence was obvious. There'd be signs of a struggle, tracks, torn fencing, blood scattered throughout the area. The goats in this case looked different. Neither animal had been eaten. Neither animal appeared to have been dragged. Both were simply lying on the ground near a tree line. The property owner noticed 2 puncture wounds on the neck of each goat. That detail made enough people curious that photographs were taken. A wildlife officer examined the scene and initially suspected some kind of animal attack, but he couldn't identify what animal might have been responsible. The wounds were unusual. Not impossible, just unusual. The case likely would have ended there if similar reports hadn't started appearing over the following days. 3 days later, a hunter discovered a dead deer less than 5 miles away. The deer showed similar injuries. Again, there was surprisingly little blood present. There were puncture wounds, and again, nobody could confidently identify what had happened. By the end of the week, several more animals had been found dead. Most were deer. One was a large wild hog. Another was a calf from a nearby farm. And that was when local rumors started spreading. People always talk, especially in small mountain communities. Some blamed coyotes, others blamed disease. A few started suggesting something much stranger. They claimed large bats had been seen flying near one of the cave systems in the area. Normally that would have been ignored. The problem was that the reports weren't coming from a single witness. They were coming from multiple people who didn't know each other. One witness claimed he saw several large shapes leaving the cave shortly after sunset. Another described seeing something circle above a pasture before disappearing toward the mountains. A third reported hearing unusual screeching sounds near the cave entrance during the evening. None of those reports proved anything. Witnesses make mistakes. People can exaggerate. Distance and darkness can make ordinary things look unusual. Still, enough reports accumulated that our department eventually became involved. Now, the cave itself sat in a remote section of forest accessible only by a rough dirt road. The entrance was considerably larger than most caves in the area, roughly 30 feet wide and extending downward into a network of tunnels that had never been fully mapped. Several agencies coordinated a survey of the area. I was part of one of the teams assigned to assist. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was the smell. It was strange. The area around the entrance contained a strong animal odor that seemed far more concentrated than it should have been. Several piles of animal droppings were located near the opening. Wildlife activity clearly existed around the cave. Whether it had any connection to the reports was another matter. We spent most of the day documenting the area. Tracks were photographed, animal remains were collected. The cave interior was explored as far as safety allowed. Nothing definitive was found. No giant bats, no unknown animals, no evidence that anything extraordinary lived there. Still, some details bothered people. Several deer carcasses were located within a few hundred yards of the cave entrance. Again, many showed puncture wounds similar to those reported elsewhere. Wildlife specialists examined them and offered possible explanations, but nobody seemed completely satisfied. The timing also continued to attract attention. Most of the sightings were occurring at night. Many happened near the same cave. And several occurred during the days leading up to a full moon. That last detail probably means nothing. I want to be clear about that. People love connecting unusual events to full moons. Most of the time it's coincidence. Still, it was something witnesses repeatedly brought up when giving statements. The night of the full moon ended up producing the most reports. Our team wasn't conducting an active search that evening, but several of us were still in the area assisting with documentation and follow-up interviews. Around dusk, 2 local residents contacted authorities, claiming they'd seen large flying animals near the ridge above the cave. Their descriptions weren't identical, but they were similar enough to get attention. Both estimated wingspans significantly larger than any bats normally found in the region. Neither witness could provide photographs. Neither witness claimed to have seen details clearly. What they reported were silhouettes, large dark shapes crossing in front of the moon. And that was it. Nothing conclusive. Just enough to keep the rumors alive. Over the next several days, additional dead wildlife continued appearing throughout the area. Then, almost as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. No more sightings or reports, no more unexplained animal deaths. The cave remained where it had always been, and the forest returned to normal. Life moved on. Most people eventually forgot about the entire thing. I probably would have as well, if not for something I personally witnessed near the end of the investigation. A few days before the report stopped, I was part of a small team conducting a final evening survey near the cave entrance. There were 3 of us. We weren't expecting to find anything. The investigation had already reached the point where everyone assumed there would never be a definitive answer. We were simply documenting the area one last time before scaling operations back. The sun had already dropped behind the mountains. The forest was beginning to darken. Visibility wasn't great, but wasn't completely dark either. I remember standing near a rocky overlook above the cave entrance when one of the other team members pointed toward the valley below. At first, I couldn't see what we were looking at, and then I noticed movement. Several dark shapes were crossing above the tree line. The distance made identification difficult, very difficult. Whatever they were, they appeared larger than most birds. Their flight pattern looked unusual. For maybe 10 seconds, all 3 of us watched them move across the valley, and then they disappeared behind a ridge. And that was it. No attack, no monster emerging from a cave. Just a brief observation that none of us could confidently explain. Now, could they have been birds? Absolutely. Could distance and lighting have distorted what we were seeing? Without question. Could there be a perfectly normal explanation for everything that happened that summer? Probably. In fact, that's still the explanation I lean toward. But what I do find interesting is that nobody ever managed to provide that explanation. The animal deaths remained unexplained, the bite marks remained unusual, the witness reports remained consistent enough to be difficult to dismiss completely, and the cave continued generating stories long after the investigation ended. Even today, local residents occasionally bring it up. Most laugh about it, some don't. As for me, I don't know. I also don't think every witness simply imagined what they saw. Unfortunately, with whatever the truth was, it disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. The sighting stopped, the animal death stopped, the investigation ended, and the mountains kept their answer. So in this third story, nobody disappeared, nobody died or got injured. In fact, if you heard the story from certain people, you'd probably dismiss it immediately and move on with your day. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you. If somebody had told me this story before I saw part of it for myself, I probably would have done the same thing. The reason it stayed with me isn't because I think something supernatural happened. I don't know. It's because I still don't have a good explanation for what multiple groups of people reported seeing over the course of nearly 3 weeks. The incident took place during the winter of 2021. The area involved was a large section of mountain forest that sat roughly 15 miles from the nearest town. The section contained several hiking trails, a few seasonal campsites, and enough wildlife that search and rescue teams were frequently called out to assist lost hunters or stranded hikers. The first report came from a pair of campers. At the time, nobody paid much attention to it. The two men claimed they'd seen a pack of wolves moving along a ridgeline shortly after sunset. And that wasn't strange. While wolves aren't common throughout much of Appalachia, occasional sightings are reported, and large wild dogs or coyotes are frequently mistaken for wolves from a distance. The unusual part wasn't the animals themselves. It was the description. Both men insisted the wolves appeared to be glowing. They described it as a faint blue-green sheen that seemed visible along portions of the animal's fur whenever the moonlight hit them. The report was written down, a few jokes were made, and everybody moved on. And about 4 days later, another report came in. This time it came from a married couple who had been driving along a mountain road after dark. Neither knew the original witnesses, neither had any reason to make up the story. Their description, though, was remarkably similar. They reported seeing several wolf-like animals standing near the tree line overlooking a field. Again, the witnesses described a strange glow. Again, they specifically mentioned a bluish color, and they struggled to explain exactly what they'd seen. At that point, the reports became interesting. Not because they proved anything, but because independent witnesses were describing similar details. A week later, a group of hunters submitted another report. Then another family. Then a hiker. The descriptions varied slightly from person to person, but several details remained consistent. The animals always appeared in groups. Most witnesses estimated between 5 and 8 wolves. The sightings generally occurred around dusk or shortly after dark, and nearly everyone described the same unusual coloration: blue, green, silver. The exact shade changed depending on the witness. The basic description remained surprisingly consistent. Now, at first, most of us assumed there was a straightforward explanation. Moonlight can create strange effects, fog can distort visibility, animal eyes often reflect light in unusual ways, distance can make almost anything look different than it actually is. All of those explanations seemed reasonable. The problem was the reports kept coming. Eventually, enough people had reported seeing the animals that our department became involved. Not because we thought glowing wolves were roaming the mountains, but because any large predator sightings near hiking areas tend to attract attention. One afternoon, I was assigned to investigate several of the locations where witnesses claimed the animals had been seen. Sarah Williams came with me. At the time, Sarah had already spent nearly a decade working in search and rescue, and was one of the more experienced people on our team. Like me, she wasn't especially impressed by the stories. We spent most of the day checking trails, interviewing witnesses, and documenting locations. Nothing stood out. No unusual tracks, no unusual animal remains, no evidence that anything extraordinary was taking place. By late afternoon, we'd essentially concluded that the sightings were probably being exaggerated through repetition. And then the sun started going down. We were driving along a Forest Service road near one of the more recent sighting locations when Sarah suddenly pointed toward a distant ridge. "Do you see that?" I looked where she was pointing. At first I didn't, and then I noticed movement. Several animals were crossing the ridgeline, approximately half a mile away. And even from that distance, the size was obvious. They were considerably larger than coyotes. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, it's difficult to say exactly. We pulled over and watched. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The wolves weren't running. They weren't hunting. They were simply moving along the ridgeline from east to west. And then I saw something happen whenever they crossed patches of open ground. The moon had already risen above the mountains, its light reflected across portions of their bodies, and for brief moments, the fur appeared almost luminous. Not glowing, that's still not the word I'd use, but there was definitely something unusual about the way the light interacted with them. The effect reminded me of certain fish scales or bird feathers that appear to change color depending on the angle. The animals would move through shadow, then moonlight would hit them, and for a second or two, portions of their fur would appear silver blue. Then the effect would vanish again. We watched the pack for perhaps a minute before they disappeared into the trees, and that was the entirety of the encounter. Just a distant observation that happened to match many of the previous witness reports. Afterward, Sarah and I spent quite a bit of time discussing possible explanations. Neither of us believed the wolves were literally glowing. The more likely explanation involved moonlight, winter conditions, and some unusual characteristic of the animals' coats. Certain species display surprisingly strange reflective properties under specific lighting conditions. And that explanation made sense. The problem was that nobody could ever confirm it. Wildlife officials never managed to identify the specific animals involved. Photographs were attempted but never produced anything unusual. Several blurry images circulated online, maybe you've seen them, but none were clear enough to prove anything. And within a few weeks, the sighting stopped. Just like that. The wolves simply disappeared from public attention. Maybe they moved to another area. Maybe witness interest faded. Maybe people stopped reporting what they saw. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that at least 3 separate groups of witnesses reported seeing nearly identical details before those reports became widely known. And then Sarah Williams and I observed something that appeared remarkably similar ourselves. Could there be a perfectly ordinary explanation? Absolutely. In fact, that's what I still believe. But every mystery doesn't need a monster to be interesting. Sometimes a mystery is simply a collection of observations that never quite fit together neatly enough to produce a final answer. The glowing wolves were one of those mysteries. Nobody was ever harmed, nothing dangerous ever occurred. The animals never approached people, they never attacked livestock, they never behaved aggressively. They simply appeared for a few weeks during one winter, walked across a handful of ridgelines under the moonlight, and then vanished back into the Appalachian forest. The fourth story happened during a search that honestly wasn't particularly unusual, at least not at first. An elderly man in his 70s had gone missing after leaving a campground near the state line. He wasn't suffering from dementia or any known medical condition. According to his family, he simply enjoyed hiking and often spent time exploring the woods on his own. The problem was that he failed to return when he said he would. After about 24 hours without contact, a search operation was organized. By that point, I'd been working search and rescue for well over a decade, and I'd participated in enough missing persons cases to know that the first day is usually the most important. If someone is lost, injured, or unable to move, every hour matters. Well, we spent the entire morning searching trails, old logging roads, creek beds, and several ridges near the campground. Nothing. No signs that the missing man had passed through the area. By late afternoon, several search teams had begun expanding farther into the surrounding forest. I was assigned to work a section of terrain roughly 2 miles from the campground, along with another volunteer named Gordon Bryant. The area was heavily wooded and relatively steep, with large rock formations scattered throughout the hillside. Most of our time was spent moving slowly through the trees while looking for anything that seemed out of place. The search continued that way for several hours, and then just before sunset, I heard something. At first I thought it was another search team using a portable radio. The sound was faint, so faint that I almost ignored it. But after a few moments, I realized it wasn't coming from a modern radio at all. It sounded like an actual broadcast. Music, voices, static. The sort of thing you would expect from an old AM radio station. I stopped walking and listened. Gordon heard it too. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded. The sounds seemed to be coming from farther down the slope. We assumed someone had left a radio in the woods, maybe a hunter or a camper. Either way, we headed toward it. The signal became stronger as we approached. The strange thing wasn't the radio itself. It was what it was playing. At first I couldn't place it, and then I started recognizing certain details. The music, the advertisements, the voices. Something about it felt very familiar. We eventually found the source sitting beside a fallen tree, and it was an old portable radio, the kind people used decades ago. The casing was scratched and weathered, but it appeared mostly intact. The speaker was still working. The broadcast was coming through clearly. I picked the radio up and listened, and that's when I started getting a strange feeling, because I recognized what I was hearing. I was born in the early 1980s. When I was growing up, my father listened to talk radio constantly. Every evening it seemed like there was some old radio show playing somewhere in the house, whether I wanted to hear it or not. As I stood there in the woods, I realized I was listening to one of those same programs. Not a modern replay or a podcast, the actual broadcast. Or at least what sounded like the actual broadcast. The advertisements were from the 1990s, the news stories from then, the sports scores being discussed were from the 1990s. Everything sounded exactly like something that would have been airing when I was a kid. I remember looking at Gordon and laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was weird. Really weird. And he agreed. For several minutes, we just stood there listening. The hosts were discussing current events as though they were happening in real time. The advertisements referenced products and businesses that either no longer existed or hadn't used those commercials in decades. It sounded like somebody had somehow tuned into the past. Obviously, that wasn't possible. Still, it was difficult to ignore how strange it felt. Well, eventually we resumed searching. I carried the radio with me while we continued working our assigned area. The broadcast never stopped. The signal remained surprisingly clear. Several times, I adjusted the tuning dial to see if I could identify a station. Nothing happened. The program continued exactly as before, no matter where the dial was positioned. I couldn't explain that. As darkness approached, our team received instructions to return to the command post. The missing man still hadn't been found. Gordon and I began making our way back through the forest. The radio continued playing the entire time. Music, commercials, talk shows, everything sounding like it comes straight out of the 90s. I remember hearing an advertisement that I hadn't heard since high school, an ad I was completely certain had disappeared decades ago. By the time we reached the command post, it was fully dark. Vehicles were parked throughout a clearing near the road. Generators were running. Search coordinators were updating maps. The operation looked exactly as it had all day. Nothing unusual or mysterious. I stepped into the edge of the clearing, and the radio immediately died. Not faded or crackled or weakened, it just stopped. 1 second it was broadcasting, the next second there was silence. The radio never produced another sound. Not that night, not the following day, not ever. We eventually brought it back to headquarters and examined it more closely. And nobody found anything remarkable. No hidden recording device, no obvious explanation. Just an old radio that no longer worked. As for the missing man, well, we eventually located him 2 days later. He'd suffered a minor injury and become stranded in a remote section of forest. Fortunately, he survived. The search ended successfully. The radio didn't. To this day, I still don't know what was happening out there. Maybe it'd been some kind of pre-recorded audio. Maybe there was a technical explanation I simply didn't understand. Maybe there was a station somewhere rebroadcasting old programs. All of those explanations sound reasonable. What I can't explain is why the radio worked perfectly for hours in the middle of the mountains and then went completely silent the moment I walked back into camp. Maybe it was a coincidence. Honestly, it probably was. But every now and then I still think about that old radio sitting beside that fallen tree, playing voices from 30 years ago in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness. The final story for tonight happened about 6 years ago. And out of everything I've talked about so far, it makes me the most uncomfortable. I've searched abandoned buildings before. Hundreds of them. Old cabins, collapsed barns, mining structures, shacks hidden deep in the woods. Most of them are exactly what you'd expect. Empty, dirty, fallen apart. This place was different. The call came in during early autumn. A 9-year-old boy had gone missing from a campground located near a mountain ridge several miles from the nearest town. According to his parents, he'd wandered away sometime during the afternoon while they were setting up camp. When they realized he was gone, they searched for nearly an hour before contacting authorities. By the time our team arrived, daylight was already beginning to fade. The boy's name was Ethan. He had no history of running away, no medical issues, no reason to intentionally leave the campground. The assumption was that he'd simply wandered off and become lost. Cases like that happen more often than people realize. Children get distracted. They chase animals, they follow trails. Sometimes they don't realize how far they've traveled until it's too late. The initial search focused on the area surrounding the campground. Teams spread out across nearby trails and forest roads. Volunteers searched creek beds and wooded sections surrounding the ridge. For the first several hours, we found absolutely nothing. No footprints or discarded clothing. No signs of where Ethan might have gone. As darkness settled in, we transitioned into a nighttime search operation. Additional personnel arrived. More equipment was brought in. The search continued through the night. Around sunrise the following morning, one of the volunteers discovered something interesting. A small section of disturbed vegetation near an overgrown path. The path wasn't marked on any modern maps. It appeared to be extremely old, possibly an abandoned access road that hadn't been used in decades. The trail climbed toward the highest section of the ridge, and a team was assembled to follow it. I was assigned to that group, along with Linda Harper and Gordon Bryant. The three of us started up the trail shortly after 8 in the morning. The climb took nearly an hour. The higher we went, the stranger the area became. The forest grew thicker. The path became narrower. In several places, fallen trees had partially blocked the route. It honestly didn't seem like somewhere anyone would choose to visit, especially a child. And then we saw the house. It sat near the very top of the ridge, overlooking miles of forest. At one point, it'd probably been beautiful. Now it looked abandoned. The structure was old enough that portions of the roof had started sagging inward. Several windows were broken. The paint had almost completely peeled away. What immediately caught my attention wasn't the condition of the building. It was the wind chimes. There were dozens and dozens of them, maybe more. They hung from the porch, from nearby trees, from hooks attached beneath the roof. Some appeared fairly normal, others did not. Several looked homemade, twisted pieces of metal tied together with wire, odd shapes cut from rusted sheets of steel, objects hanging upside down from string. None of them matched, none of them looked decorative. The entire property felt, and I know this sounds crazy, but the entire property felt evil. I know that's a vague description, but it's the best one I can give. I've spent most of my adult life searching isolated places, and something about that house immediately made me very uneasy. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. Linda looked at the structure for several seconds before speaking. "You guys getting a weird feeling from this place?" "Yeah," Gordon replied. I agreed. The house sat completely silent, except for the movement of the wind chimes. No vehicles or smoke, no signs of recent activity. Still, because a child was missing nearby, we had no choice but to investigate. We approached the front door and knocked several times. No answer. Linda called out, "Hello?" Nothing. Gordon walked around one side of the house while I checked the other. and every window I looked through showed the same thing. Dust, old furniture, dark rooms, no people or movement. Eventually, we regrouped near the front entrance. The door wasn't locked, and because of the missing child, we made the decision to enter. The interior looked even older than the outside. Dust covered nearly every surface. Several rooms contained furniture that appeared decades out of date. A grandfather clock stood against one wall. Bookshelves filled with deteriorating books lined another. In some places, it honestly looked as though somebody had simply walked away and never returned. The strange decorations continued throughout the house. Symbols had been carved into portions of the woodwork. Most were simply geometric shapes, circles, lines, patterns. I couldn't identify any of them. To be fair, they may have meant absolutely nothing. People carve strange things into wood all the time. Still, combined with everything else, they added to the atmosphere. We spent nearly 20 minutes searching the structure, and nothing. No sign of Ethan, no indication anybody currently lived there. Eventually, we concluded the house probably had no connection to the disappearance, and we began preparing to leave. And then I noticed movement. At first, I thought I imagined it. Just a brief flicker near one side of the building. I stopped walking and looked back. There it was again. A shape moving behind a dirty window near ground level. A cellar window. I immediately called Linda and Gordon over. All three of us approached the side of the house. The window was partially covered in dirt and grime, but there was definitely something moving inside. For a moment, I thought it might be an animal. And then I saw a face. A child's face. I don't think any of us waited more than a second. We rushed down the cellar entrance and forced the old door open. The basement was dark and smelled strongly of mildew. Flashlights came out immediately. We moved down the stairs, and the room wasn't especially big. Maybe, 20 feet across. Old shelves lined the walls. Boxes sat stacked in corners. And near the back of the room, curled beside a support beam, was Ethan. Alive, scared, and completely confused. Well, the relief all three of us felt in that moment, it's difficult to describe. After nearly a full day of searching, we had finally found him. The strange part came afterward. Once we got him outside and started asking questions, Ethan couldn't explain how he'd gotten there. Not just parts of it, any of it. He remembered being at the campground, walking into the woods. After that, almost nothing. He didn't know how he reached the ridge. He didn't know how he entered the house. He didn't know how long he'd been inside the cellar. According to medical personnel, he was dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise healthy. No evidence suggested anybody had harmed him. No evidence suggested anybody had ever been in the house recently. And that should have been the end of the story. In many ways it was. Ethan was reunited with his family. The search ended successfully, and everyone went home. But the house continued bothering me. Over the following months, I occasionally asked questions about it. Who owned it? Who had lived there? Why had it been abandoned? And the answers were surprisingly difficult to find. Property records existed, but they were incomplete. Ownership appeared to have changed multiple times over the years. Nobody seemed to know much about its history. Nobody seemed particularly interested in preserving it either. Roughly a year later, I learned the county had condemned the structure, and shortly afterward it was demolished. Today there is very little of it left, just fragments of foundation hidden beneath brush and trees. Now maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation for everything. Maybe Ethan wandered inside while lost and simply couldn't remember the details afterward. Children sometimes forget things after stressful events. But even now, years later, I still remember standing in front of that house for the first time. I remember those strange wind chimes hanging from the trees. I remember the carved symbols. I remember the silence. And I remember the feeling I got the moment I stepped through the front door. I've searched a lot of places throughout Appalachia. Most of them feel abandoned, That house didn't. That house felt occupied by something bad. Well, those are some of the strangest cases I've encountered during my years working search and rescue in Appalachia. Looking back on them now, I don't think any of these stories prove anything supernatural. I don't know that there's vampires living in caves, glowing wolves roaming the ridgelines, or radio somehow broadcasting signals from the past. Most of the people I've worked with over the years, they'd probably tell you the same thing. The problem is that having a reasonable explanation and having the correct explanation aren't always the same thing. In search and rescue, our job is usually to find answers. We locate the missing person, we determine where they went, we identify what happened and how it happened. Most cases eventually reach a point where all the pieces fit together. These didn't. A young couple vanished after leaving behind a trail of blood that ended at the edge of a cliff. A series of unexplained animal deaths were linked to sightings nobody could verify. Multiple groups of witnesses reported seeing wolves that appeared almost luminous beneath the moonlight. An old radio played broadcasts from my childhood before going silent forever. And a missing child somehow ended up inside an abandoned house at the top of a mountain ridge without any memory of how he got there. Maybe every one of those stories has a perfectly ordinary explanation. Honestly, I hope they do. I've spent enough time in the mountains to know that nature creates mysteries all by itself. Distance distorts things. Darkness hides details. People misremember events. Fear changes perception, and sometimes a collection of small coincidences can look a lot stranger than it really is. But every once in a while, you come across something that doesn't fit neatly into a report, and no matter how many years pass, you still find yourself thinking about it. And that's what these stories became for me. Not proof, just unexplained questions. The mountains are full of them. Most people think of Appalachia as a place of forests, rivers, trails, and small towns tucked between ridges. And most of the time, that's exactly what it is. Families live here. People work here. Kids grow up here. Life goes on exactly the way it always has. But it's also a place with thousands of square miles of wilderness, countless caves, forgotten roads, abandoned structures, and stretches of forest where a person can walk for hours without seeing another human being. There are places out there that few people ever visit. And there are stories that never receive an explanation. The first time I watched a bull elk collapse from a broken leg in Lamar Valley, there were 100 tourists 10 yards away with cameras in their hands. The animal had stopped wrong in a shallow rut during a sparring run. One miscalculation. The leg snapped clean. The sound carried farther than people expected. For a few seconds, nobody moved. And then the phones came up. I was there on a routine patrol assignment, still new to Yellowstone. Still learning how quickly something ordinary can turn permanent out here. The elk tried to stand twice, failed both times. The herd moved on without him. By sunset, predators had already circled back. That was my first lesson in Yellowstone. The park doesn't pause because something went wrong. My name is Peter Wins, and I've worked search and rescue here for 14 years, long enough to stop reacting to beauty. Long enough to see structure beneath the scenery. People think of Yellowstone as landmarks, old faithful erupting on schedule, the bright layered terraces at Mammoth Hot Springs, the surreal color of grand prismatic spring, the roar of the lower falls crashing into the canyon. Those places are real. They're also controlled, managed, bordered by railings and boardwalks and signs written in clear language. The rest of the park stretches far beyond that vision. North of Canyon Village, the timber closes in thick enough that noon light turns flat and gray. Near Norris Geyser Basin, the ground steams in quiet vents that don't announce how deep the heat runs. The ridgelines around Mount Washburn take wind from 3 directions at once and send it back down the slopes in unpredictable bursts. Yellowstone covers over 2 million acres. That scale matters. Terrain changes quickly. Elevation shifts your breathing. Weather arrives earlier than forecast. Distance looks manageable until you account for grade. Search and rescue exists inside those margins. I didn't take this job because I wanted stories. I grew up in Montana. My father worked seasonal trail crews during the summers. I learned to read cloud buildup before I learned to drive. After serving in the Army, I came back with a preference for clear systems. Yellowstone is one, even if it doesn't advertise itself that way. There are rules here. Cold water steals body heat fast, especially in the Yellowstone River near Fishing Bridge during runoff. Thermal crust near the edges of some basins will collapse without warning if you step off marked ground. A 10-mile hike in Hayden Valley under sun and wind demands more water than most visitors carry. If you respect those rules, you can predict most outcomes. When dispatch calls in a missing hiker, Marty Singh gives us the details in the same measured tone every time. Last known coordinates, clothing description, experience level, time overdue. We confirm, we map, we assign sectors. Rena Caldwell checks gear before we move. She counts carabiners without being asked. She studies the terrain overlay longer than most. If aviation's required, Wes Harlan clears airspace and checks wind drift over ridges. He knows which canyon walls create turbulence before you ever see the rotor spin. Most missions follow a pattern. Separation at a junction, underestimated distance on a switchback, dehydration, a twisted ankle near inspiration point. A solo backpacker overdue near the waterfalls. We move, we locate, we extract. That's the rhythm. Yellowstone, for all its size, behaves predictably most of the time. You learn how long it takes to move a mile in lodgepole pine versus open meadow. You learn how your radio signals carry along the canyon rim versus down in the timber. You learn where GPS loses strength near thermal interference and where it locks in clean. Experience sharpens your internal measurements. After enough years, you know when your body has climbed 800 feet versus 600. You know when 40 pounds of gear should have slowed you more than it did. You know when a ridge should appear in your line of sight based on map and pace. That calibration keeps you alive. It also means you notice when something shifts. There are areas in this park where the spacing between landmarks feels tighter than it measures on paper. Corridors of timber where sound carries in ways that don't match the density of the trees. Stretches of trail near certain basin edges where wind behaves inconsistently with the open sky above. None of that appears on brochures. Visitors move from Mammoth to Old Faithful to the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone and believe they've seen it all. They haven't stepped into the longer miles beyond the maintained loops. They haven't felt how quiet it becomes near the backcountry stretches north of Tower Fall after the day traffic fades. Yellowstone doesn't announce how big it is. It lets you misjudge it. And it doesn't announce its strangeness either. The first few years I worked here, I focused entirely on procedure. Map, pace, weather, equipment. If something felt off, I checked batteries, rechecked coordinates, adjusted for terrain. Most irregularities resolve that way. But after a decade, you build a deeper familiarity with the park. You recognize how the sun drops behind the range. You anticipate how long the canyon shadow takes to reach the river. You know how long it should take to cross a meadow with steady footing and moderate wind. When those expectations fail to line up, it stands out. Yellowstone is stable enough that deviation becomes obvious to anyone who's spent enough time inside it. There are specific ridgelines and timber corridors where I've seen that deviation more than once. Specific creek bends and basin edges where radio behavior changes in subtle but measurable ways. specific stretches where distance compresses or expands against the clock you're wearing. The park doesn't look different in those places. Doesn't sound different, but the math shifts. And in search and rescue, when the math shifts, you pay attention. Because the only thing more dangerous than weather or wildlife in Yellowstone is assuming the terrain will behave exactly the way it did yesterday. It won't. And the first time that difference mattered, it began with a call that should have been routine. The call came in just after noon. Clear skies over Canyon Valley, light wind out of the west, 68 degrees and dry, the kind of day that fills every pullout and clogs every trailhead by 10 in the morning. Marty's voice came through, steady as always.
14-year-old male, separated from family near the junction between Ribbon Lake Trail and the main loop. Last visual was approximately 45 minutes ago. Phone pinged twice. Signal weak, but active.
Teenagers get turned around fast in timber. They move quicker than adults, and they're more likely to keep walking instead of stopping. Rena and I staged at the trailhead within 20 minutes. The parents were there, mother pale, father trying to answer questions clearly. The boy's name was Tyler. Blue windbreaker, gray hiking shoes, small day pack with 1 bottle of water. Did he cross the creek? I asked.
No,
The father said immediately.
he was right behind us. We stopped at the junction sign, and he wasn't there when we turned back.
The creek ran shallow this time of year, but cold. Crossing it would mean wet boots. Wet boots meant slowed movement. Slowed movement meant we'd find him quicker. We marked the last known point at the junction sign. Clean dirt, heavy foot traffic, nothing useful. Rena took the east sector. I took west for 50 yards, then cut back. Standard, expanding search. About 20 minutes in, Rena called out,
Peter.
I crossed to her position. Fresh boot prints in soft soil, smaller size, deep enough to be recent. The tread pattern matched what the father described, gray hiking shoes with a triangular lug pattern. The prints were on the far side of the creek. No scuffing on the near bank, no clear slide marks down the mud. Parents said he didn't cross, Rena said.
Parents don't always know, I replied.
We crossed. The water came just over the ankle, cold enough to sting through fabric. On the far bank, the prints were clear, even spacing, straight line, no erratic pivots like someone panicking. He'd moved calmly. We called it in. Marty logged our direction change.
Phone just attempted another ping.
Marty said.
Weak. Approximately 300 yards northeast of your current position.
That aligned with the direction of the tracks. We followed. The prints kept steady through timber. They avoided deadfall naturally, as if Tyler had adjusted his path deliberately instead of wandering. At one point, they curved slightly around a shallow dip, then returned to the original heading. Logical movement, no backtracking. After 10 minutes, Marty's voice cut back in.
Parents received a voicemail from Tyler's phone. Time-stamped 1 minute ago.
What did it say? I asked.
Short message, I'm back at the sign.
He replied. Rena and I stopped walking. The junction sign was behind us. We'd left it nearly 40 minutes ago. Parents confirmed Tyler hadn't returned. Ping location? I asked.
Still northeast of you, moving slowly.
We kept following the tracks. Another 100 yards. The timber thinned slightly. Sunlight filtered through. We saw him before he saw us. Tyler was sitting against a fallen tree, knees pulled up, blue windbreaker zipped to his chin. He looked tired but alert. Tyler, I called. He turned fast. Relief hit his face immediately. We approached slowly, and no visible injuries, no signs of hypothermia, beyond mild shivering. "Did you cross the creek?" I asked while Rena checked his pulse and hands. He shook his head. "No." "Well, we found your prints across it." "I didn't cross anything." "Did you call your mom?" "I tried earlier, but it wouldn't connect." "She got a voicemail just now." He frowned. I didn't leave one." Well, stress scrambles memory, I thought. That happens. We wrapped him in a thermal layer and started moving back. As we walked, I glanced at the ground. Our tracks were clear in the soil, fresh. Tyler's earlier prints ran straight back toward the creek. At the waterline, we paused. There were our inbound tracks. There were Tyler's outbound tracks. On both sides of the creek. I looked at Rena, and she looked at the bank carefully. There was no slide mark where he would have entered, no disturbed mud on the near side from a first crossing. Only the clean pattern of prints already established on the far bank when we arrived. We crossed again with him. Back of the junction sign, the parents ran to him, tears, hugging, overlapping voices. Marty logged recovery time. And standard debrief followed. I asked Tyler once more about the creek. "I saw your lights in the trees," he said casually. "It's daylight," I said. "Yeah, I know, but I saw him before you called out. I thought you were behind me." We hadn't deployed headlamps. None were active, I thought. People misperceive under stress. Light filtering through timber can reflect unpredictably. We wrote the report clearly. Subject located alive. No major injury. Movement inconsistent with subject recollection. Phone irregularities, likely signal delay. The official explanation was simple. Confusion, delayed voicemail, stress memory gaps, overlapping foot traffic misread. Every piece of it had a rational option. But the spacing of those prints, clear, forward-moving, already established across the creek before our boots entered the water, they stayed in my mind. Not because it frightened me, but because things didn't line up. And in this job, that matters. The hill above Hayden Valley. The call came in at 9:47 p.m. Group of hikers overdue near the ridge line above Hayden Valley. 12 names on the backcountry permit. They were supposed to be down before dark. No checkout at the trailhead. Weather was stable. Clear sky, thin crescent moon, wind low but steady along the ridge. Night searches change the equation. Depth perception drops. Sound carries differently. You move slower because footing matters more than speed. Rena and I staged with 2 additional team members and began the ascent. The trail up that hill is gradual at first, then steep for the last quarter mile, gravel over hard dirt, loose rock near the crest. About halfway up, we heard it. A low buzzing sound. Not mechanical in the way a generator hums, not sharp like a drone. It had a layered quality, like multiple tones sitting on top of each other. It carried down the slope in steady waves. Rena stopped walking. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I said. We scanned the sky. Clear, stars visible, no aircraft strobes, no rotor sound. The buzzing didn't rise or fall with wind. It stayed constant. We continued climbing. As we neared the crest, we saw silhouettes against the sky. All 12 hikers were standing at the top of the hill. They weren't moving or talking. They were all looking straight up. Every one of them. We closed the distance quickly. "Park Service," I called out. "You need to come down." No reaction. They were positioned close to the edge, near a steep drop that fell toward the valley. One misstep in the dark, and somebody could have gone over. The buzzing grew louder near the top. It vibrated faintly in my chest, not painful, but present. I stepped up beside the nearest hiker, a woman in her 30s. Her face was tilted skyward, eyes wide open, unblinking. "What are you looking at?" I asked. She didn't answer. I followed her line of sight. Directly above the ridge, maybe a few hundred feet up, something hovered. It wasn't shaped like any aircraft I recognized. There were no blinking navigation lights, no beam projecting downward. It looked like a dark, flattened oval against the stars. Edges indistinct, but clearly defined against the sky. It held position exactly, without any drift. The buzzing intensified slightly. Rena stepped beside me. "You seeing this?" "Yeah," I said again. None of the hikers reacted to our voices. They stood shoulder to shoulder, just staring up. A few had their hands slightly raised, palms forward. No reaching, just lifted. I keyed my radio. "Marty, we have visual on subjects. They're stationary at the ridge crest and we need assistance." The buzzing interfered with the transmission. Static bled into the channel.
Repeat.
Marty's voice cut in, then broke apart. I tried again. The object shifted slightly to the left. No acceleration or visible propulsion. It simply repositioned. The hikers took a half step forward as a group, toward the edge. And that snapped me out of watching. "We gotta pull them back," I said to Rena. And we moved fast. I grabbed the nearest man by his backpack straps and I yanked him backward. He resisted weakly, not actively fighting, just stiff. Rena hooked an arm around the woman beside her and dragged her down to a seated position. The buzzing spiked for a second, louder and sharper, then dropped back to its steady tone. "Down," I said to the others. "Sit down." One of our team members reached the crest and began physically guiding two hikers away from the edge. It took effort. They were responsive, but delayed, like they were waking from deep sleep. The object above us rose slightly, no tilt or visible thrust. It climbed straight up. As it gained altitude, the buzzing softened, and within seconds, it was higher than the surrounding ridgelines. Then it moved laterally at a speed that didn't match conventional aircraft. Smooth and fast, no sound change. It disappeared against the star field, and the buzzing stopped instantly. Complete silence followed. Wind resumed its normal tone through the grass. The hikers blinked almost in unison. The woman Rena had pulled down looked around, confused. "What happened?" she asked. "You were standing at the edge," I said. She looked over her shoulder at the drop and went pale. "We were watching it," one of the men said slowly. "It came over the valley." "Watching what, exactly?" I asked. He pointed upward. "The light." "There was no light," Rena said. He frowned. "It was right there." Another hiker spoke up. It was humming." "Do you remember walking up here?" I asked. They nodded. "Do you remember standing this close to the edge?" They all looked down at the drop. Several shook their heads. One woman started crying quietly. We moved them downhill immediately. No debate or delay. Radio communication normalized halfway down the slope. Marty's voice came through clear.
"Lost your transmission for 30 seconds. Repeat status."
"Subjects located," I said. "All ambulatory, descending now." At base, statements were taken. Descriptions varied slightly, but all 12 agreed on key points. A dark shape above the ridge, a humming sound, a feeling of being drawn upward. No one remembered us arriving until we physically grabbed them. We filed the report carefully. Unidentified aerial object observed. Audible buzzing interference. Subjects disoriented at ridge edge. No injuries. County officials followed up. Air traffic control confirmed no scheduled flights in that sector at the time. No drones registered. No military exercises. The hikers were interviewed separately. Stories aligned too closely to dismiss as suggestion. Word spread quickly. Local news picked it up. Strange lights in Yellowstone. Most people laughed it off. Weather balloon, drone prank, mass suggestion. But nobody could explain the radio interference. Nobody could explain why 12 people stood motionless at the edge of a dark drop, unresponsive to voices, until physically pulled away. Rena and I were asked if we believed it was extraterrestrial. We didn't answer that question. We described what we saw, we described the sound, we described the movement. After that night, I added the hill above Hayden Valley to the list of places I pay closer attention to. Not because of speculation, but because for 30 seconds on a clear night, 12 people stopped responding to their surroundings and stared at something that did not behave like any aircraft I've ever seen. And if we'd arrived just, a minute later, I think at least one of them would have stepped forward. The missing minutes on the switchbacks. The call came in mid-afternoon. Solo hiker overdue on the Mount Washburn Trail. Female, early 30s, experienced. Signed out at 9:10 a.m., planned to summit and return by 1 p.m. Her car was still on the lot at 4:25. Weather was steady but thinning. High clouds moving in from the west. Wind picking up along exposed sections. Mount Washburn isn't technical, but it's exposed. The switchbacks climb gradually, then tighten near the summit. You can see long stretches of trail from below, which makes it easier to search visually. Rena and I staged at 4:50. We've timed that ascent in training. With gear, moderate pace, takes 50 to 60 minutes to reach the fire lookout tower at the top. Descent is quicker, about 40 if footing is good. We moved at standard search pace, not jogging, not pushing. First switchback marker, 8 minutes. Second, 16. Breathing matched the grade, legs steady, nothing unusual. We hit the third marker. I checked my watch. 21 minutes. That was fast. I looked up the slope. The next two switchbacks were visible. We should have been closer to 30 minutes at this point. Feels quick, I said. Rena glanced at her watch. Yeah. We didn't speed up. We continued climbing. The overlook section near the summit should have taken another 25 minutes from where we stood. We reached it in 12. I stopped. Rena stopped beside me. We both checked our watches again. 33 minutes total since leaving the trailhead. That wasn't possible at our pace with full packs. You running? She asked. No. You feel like you're running. No. We turned and looked back down the slope. The trail snaked below exactly as it always did. Same terrain and elevation markers. I keyed my radio. Hey Marty, confirm departure time from trailhead.
Logged 16:52.
Marty replied. Confirm current time.
17:17.
I looked at my watch. 17:24. Say that again, I said.
17:17.
Rena held up her watch. 17:25. Yeah, Marty, our watches read 17:25. Pause.
Yeah, that's not possible,
Marty said.
Your last check-in was at 17:12.
We haven't checked in since departure, I said. Another pause.
I have you checking in at 1712 near marker 3.
Rena and I stared at each other. We didn't transmit at marker 3, she said. Marty replayed the log. Our voices came through clearly.
Unit 2 at marker 3, continuing ascent. The timestamp, 1712.
We were still physically climbing at that moment. I felt the slope beneath my boots, the wind against my jacket, and the disconnect between what my body had done and what the log recorded. Copy, I said slowly. We're at the overlook now.
Logged,
Marty replied. The missing hiker was visible from the overlook. She was sitting on a rock near a stunted pine about 50 yards off trail. Alive, thank God, and upright. We moved toward her. She looked up as we approached. You guys just passed me, she said. No, Rena said, we're just arriving. No, you walked by, the woman insisted. I waved, but you didn't stop. What time was that? I asked. 10 minutes ago, maybe 15. We checked her vitals. Slight dehydration, mild confusion, no injury. What happened? I asked. I kept passing the same bend in the trail, she said. I thought I was descending, but the fire tower kept appearing again. How long were you up here? Rena asked. She frowned. Oh, I don't know, an hour, maybe 2? Her phone showed her last summit photo, taken at 10:48 a.m. Her step counter indicated she had walked over 22,000 steps since then. That number suggested far more movement than the trail length would account for. We began descent together. Halfway down, I checked my watch again. 17:41. Time, I asked Rena. 17:42. I keyed Marty. Current time.
17:35.
He said. 7-minute difference. Confirm your system clock, I said.
Copy. Synced with NPS server at 1600.
He replied.
No drift detected.
We continued descending. The trail felt normal. Distance felt appropriate. We watched the trailhead. I looked at my watch. 18:03. Marty's log showed our arrival at 17:56. 7 minutes ago. Back at base, we cross-checked devices. Rena's watch and mine matched exactly. Both were 7 minutes ahead of dispatch. We checked them against an external reference clock. They were correct. Marty's system showed no error. The recorded audio of our 1712 check-in was clean. Our voices clear. Time-stamped. We had no memory of transmitting. The hiker's statement matched her timeline internally. She believed she'd been moving continuously for hours, yet her physical fatigue did not align with that level of exertion. We filed the report carefully. Subject located alive. Disorientation likely due to fatigue and mild dehydration. Device timing discrepancy noted. Radio log irregularity under review. Equipment test showed no malfunction. GPS tracks showed our ascent as a clean line following the switchbacks. Distance logged, normal. Elapsed time according to dispatch, normal. Elapsed time according to our watches and our physical perception, shortened on ascent, ascended on descent. 7 minutes missing in one direction, 7 minutes gained in the other. Rena and I went back to the overlook 2 weeks later during a routine patrol. Clear sky, no search in progress. And we timed the ascent again. 56 minutes. Exactly where it should be. We checked in at marker 3. Marty logged it at the same time our watches showed. No discrepancy. The trail looked the same. The wind felt the same. Nothing about Mount Washburn suggested irregularity. But that afternoon, on a measured climb we both know well, we reached the summit 20 minutes faster than we should have without increasing pace. And our voices checked in from a position that we had not reached yet. The missing minutes never appeared. They remain in the log, time-stamped, recorded, and unaccounted for. The white line on the ridge. The call came in just after 11 a.m. Two adult hikers, late 20s, overdue on a ridge run east of the Yellowstone River. They'd planned a loop that crossed an exposed spine above timberline and dropped back down near marked drainage. Clear forecast, no storms predicted, light wind, visibility unlimited. They hadn't checked out by their planned return time, and a friend waiting at the trailhead had grown uneasy. Rena and I staged within 40 minutes. Midday light was sharp. The sky was clean blue. You could see miles in every direction from the lower approach. The ridge above us cut a narrow line against the horizon. Nothing about the weather suggested trouble. We began the ascent at a steady pace. Open meadow at first, then scrub pine, then rock and thin soil as the slope steepened. About an hour in, we reached the shoulder below the ridge crest. And that's when we saw it. Across the top of the ridge, stretching left to right as far as we could see, was a wall of white. Not fog drifting in, not cloud lowering. A defined line. On our side of the line, the air was clear, blue sky overhead, sunlight sharp on the rocks. Beyond the line, everything was white. No detail, no depth. It looked like someone had drawn a boundary across the ridge and filled the far side with milk. Rena stopped beside me. Wind on our side moved normally, steady and predictable. The white mass beyond the ridge didn't move. It didn't roll or swirl. It just held. We approached cautiously. The boundary wasn't gradual. It was abrupt. At roughly 10 yards from the line, the air felt much cooler. I extended a trekking pole into it. The tip disappeared instantly into white. Pulled it back and clear again. We keyed the radio. Marty, confirm weather in our sector?
Clear skies,
He began.
no precipitation within 50 miles.
Yeah, so you seeing any cloud formations over the ridge east of our position?
Negative.
We stepped forward together, and crossing that line felt like stepping into dense smoke. Visibility dropped to less than 5 feet. Sound dampened immediately. The wind that had been steady on our backs vanished. It wasn't replaced with calm. It just stopped. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. "Rena?" I said. "I'm here." And then snow began falling. Not from above, I don't think. It was like it appeared in the air around us. Fine flakes forming and dropping at ground level, settling instantly onto rock and scrub. I looked up. Above the white ceiling, the sky was still blue. Snow was forming beneath clear sky. Within seconds, a thin layer coated the ground at our boots. "Mark the boundary," Rena said. And I tied a strip of orange tape to a scrub branch just inside the clear air, and another a few feet into the white. We stepped back into the clear side. Sunlight, wind, no snow. The tape inside the white blurred from view. We circled left along the ridge, staying on the clear side. The white mass extended as far as we could see. It wasn't drifting downhill or rising upward. It just held its line. "We can't wait," I began. They could be in there. And we re-entered. This time we moved deliberately. Compass out, short steps, physical contact maintained. Footprints behind us vanished quickly. Snow accumulated faster than it should have. "Mark every 10 yards, Rena said. We tied tape to low branches as we moved. The snow underfoot felt different. It wasn't powder. It compacted too easily and filled back in too fast. After roughly 200 yards, measured by pacing, we saw silhouettes ahead. 2 figures standing near a small cluster of rocks. They weren't moving. We closed distance. Both hikers were upright, facing the same way. "Park Service," I called. They turned slowly, faces pale but alert. "You found it too," one of them began. "We followed the tracks." "What tracks?" I asked. There was a set of footprints ahead of us. We thought someone else was on the ridge," they said. I scanned the ground. Snow covered everything. "No other teams are out here," I said. "There were prints," the first hiker said. "We kept following them. They were just ahead, and every time we caught up, they went farther." "How long have you been in this?" Rena asked. They looked at each other. "An hour?" one guessed. I checked my watch. We'd crossed the boundary less than 15 minutes earlier. "Any injuries?" I asked. They shook their heads. "Cold?" "A little." We began immediate extraction, and as we moved back toward our marked path, the buzzing absence of wind remained constant. The snow continued forming around us. Tape markers appeared and disappeared within seconds as accumulation thickened. When we reached the boundary, it was still exactly where we'd first seen it. We stepped through, and it was clear air, full sunlight. Wind resumed instantly. The snow on our jackets melted rapidly. Behind us, the white wall remained fixed in place. Within 30 seconds, the white mass began thinning. Not drifting, but dissolving. The line lost its sharp edge and faded like breath on glass. Within a minute, the ridge beyond was visible again. No snow, dry rock, blue sky overhead. We turned back. The area where the white hound had been showed no trace of moisture or frost. No residual snow, no fog bank rolling off. Just clear air. Well, we escorted the hikers down, and during debrief, they both described the same thing. A defined white wall appearing ahead of them on the ridge, a line of footprints leading into it. They followed, and the prints stayed just out of reach. They believed they'd walked for at least an hour inside it. Weather records later confirmed 0 precipitation in that sector. Satellite imagery showed clear sky. No cloud formation or cell storm or anomaly. Well, we returned to that ridge 2 weeks later during routine patrol. Bright sky, normal wind, clear visibility, no sign of the boundary. No evidence snow had ever formed there. The ridge still looks the same from below, sharp against the horizon, unremarkable. But I don't approach it casually anymore. Now there's one night I don't log in the system. Wasn't a rescue. No call came in. No coordinates were assigned. It happened on a routine patrol, and if I wrote it down the way it unfolded, it would sit in the archive with no category to file under. It was late October. The park had thinned out, most seasonal traffic gone. Nights came earlier and colder. The air carried that dry edge before first snow. I was running a solo perimeter sweep near a closed thermal corridor north of Canyon Village. People slip past barriers sometimes. Teenagers mostly. The patrol was standard. Radio check at 2100, battery full, headlamp at low beam. The forest in that sector grows tight. Lodgepole pine packs close, trunks pale and straight. The ground is uneven but predictable. Roots, fallen needles, shallow dips. At night, everything narrows to the circle your light cuts in front of you. At 21:18, I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered. Spoken clearly from somewhere ahead and slightly right. I stopped moving. A woman's voice. Calm. I waited, listening for a second call. It came again, same tone and distance. I keyed my radio quietly and asked dispatch if anyone was in my sector. Negative. I stepped forward. If someone had slipped into a closed area after dark, they could be injured, disoriented, cold. My beam moved across the trunks, and then it found her. She stood between two pines, roughly 30 yards ahead, still facing me, arms down at her sides. I called out standard procedure, identify herself, ask if she needed assistance. No reply. She raised one hand slowly, not high, just enough to be visible in the light, and waved. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was deliberate, slow side-to-side movement of her fingers and palm. I moved forward, careful with footing. 25 yards. The beam caught more detail. Long pale coat, not outdoor gear. The fabric hung straight without catching on brush. Her hair fell to her shoulders. She didn't shift her weight or look around, didn't react to the light in her eyes. She simply continued that slow wave. Now, people in distress behave unpredictably. They move, they call out, they ask questions, they show confusion. This woman did none of that. I closed distance again, 20 yards. Her face came fully into view. She was smiling. Her eyes were open wider than relaxed posture would suggest. They didn't blink under the beam. The air around us held steady at mid-30s. My breath showed with each exhale. Hers did not. Wind brushed the treetops above us. I heard it clearly. And her coat did not move. I took another step, 18 yards. Her hand kept waving. The smile deepened slightly as I approached. Every instinct I rely on in this job activated at once. This was wrong. The forest floor beneath her feet should have snapped twigs under weight. I heard nothing. Her shadow should have shifted with the angle of my headlamp. It remained strangely uniform. She took a step toward me. Her motion was smooth and measured, like someone sliding forward on rails. There was no sound, no adjustment for uneven ground. My pulse spiked. She spoke my name again, familiar in a way that reached somewhere deeper than recognition. And that was the moment my mind tried to reconcile what my eyes were seeing. The curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, the way her head tilted slightly when she smiled. I knew that face, but I didn't say the name out loud. I stayed rooted for one more second, forcing myself to catalog details instead of reacting. Skin tone matched memory, hair color, small mark above the left eyebrow. She took another step forward, and the smile widened just enough to reveal teeth. I turned and I ran. Not controlled withdrawal or cautious repositioning, I ran full speed through timber. Branches struck my shoulders, roots caught my stride. My radio bounced against my chest, but I didn't slow down and I didn't look back. I reached the service road and pivoted hard, sweeping the tree line with my beam. Nothing. Just trunks and shadow. No pale code or figure or movement. The forest stood exactly as it had before. Wind moved through it normally now. I keyed my radio and requested a vehicle pickup without elaboration. I kept my tone steady. I didn't report a threat. When I returned to base, Rena asked me what happened, and I didn't answer immediately. I went to my locker and sat down. I replayed the face in my mind carefully. I grew up in Montana. I knew that face from childhood photographs, from holidays, from hospital rooms. I'd watched it grow thin from chemotherapy. I'd stood beside it in a casket. Whatever it was in the tree line, it had looked exactly like my mother. But I knew it wasn't her. I knew whatever that thing was had been pretending. My mother had been dead for 16 years, and that wasn't her. If you work long enough in a place this large, you stop pretending it's only one thing. Yellowstone is waterfalls and families, and steam rising in clear morning light. It's elk moving through frost and bison crossing highways like they own them. It's laughter on boardwalks and the steady rhythm of boots on marked trails. But it's also something else. Sometimes you're halfway through a patrol and the forest goes quiet in a way that feels deliberate. Not natural quiet or the normal hush when wind drops. A kind of pressure that settles in your ears before you notice it's there. Sometimes you catch movement in your peripheral vision that doesn't match the direction of the trees. A figure between trunks that's gone when you turn your head fully toward it. Sometimes the radio carries a half-second of breath before a transmission that never comes. I've walked ridge lines at dusk and felt watched from angles that don't exist on the map. I've seen shapes standing at the edge of thermal steam that dissolve the moment you focus on them. I've found footprints in fresh dust that lead straight into open ground and then stop, with no turn and no backtrack. Most of it you explain. Wind, wildlife, fatigue. Your brain trying to complete patterns in low light. But not all of it. There are nights when the air feels occupied, when the dark between trees looks layered instead of flat, when a voice sounds close enough to touch and your training tells you not to respond. I don't romanticize it or label it. I log what I can measure. I bring people home when I'm able. But I've learned something after 14 years inside these boundaries. You see all kinds of people in Yellowstone. Some of them are alive. Some of them are dead. And some of them are pretending to be people. Whatever you do out there after dark, make sure you know which is which. So you're the detective, huh? Didn't think you'd actually show. Not that I blame you. This isn't exactly prime real estate for an investigation. Ash Pines Mall, middle of nowhere. Nothing but cracked pavement, dead storefronts, and a flickering open late sign that hasn't been true for years. Still, I get it. Kids go missing, rumors start flying, and eventually someone higher up decides it's time to stop ignoring the place. Took long enough. Most people just scroll past the videos, laugh, and move on. But you didn't. Alright then. I wasn't sure about this. Talking to a cop, detective, whatever, never sits right with me. But people are getting hurt, and it's tied to this place. I don't care what they call it online, a challenge, a game, some urban legend. It is real enough to me. And if someone's finally listening, maybe it's time I said something. I guess I should start at the beginning. My name is Sam, and I'm the night security guard here at Ash Pines. I've been working this job for almost 4 years now. The title makes it sound more official than it is. Really, I just walk laps through an empty building for 8 hours straight, make sure nobody breaks anything or dies in the stairwells. That's the job. I didn't grow up thinking this was where I'd end up. Used to be a forklift operator out near Weller Creek, back when the lumber yard was still open. Got laid off when they downsized, and after that it was just one short-term gig after another. Packing boxes, unloading trucks, hard work, but not the kind that really goes anywhere. Then one day, I saw an ad online. Night watchman needed. No experience required. That was it. No fancy company logo, just a number to call and an address that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Figured it was a scam or some kind of dead-end gig. But I didn't have better options. So I drove out and knocked on the side door like the ad said. Guy named Carl let me in. He ran security at the time. Older guy. Looked like he'd been doing this since the 80s. He barely looked at my resume. Just asked if I had a reliable ride and could stay awake past midnight. I said, sure. He gave me a ring of keys, pointed to the break room, and that was that. Anyway, I have been working the night shift here since April. Wasn't supposed to be permanent. Picked it up to help cover bills while prices kept going up. Groceries, gas, Everything seemed more expensive this year. My 2 kids were already reminding me that Christmas was coming, and I didn't want to be the dad who shrugged when they asked for bikes. So I took the hours. Nights pay a little bit more. Nobody else wanted them. And it made sense at the time. The mall's mostly dead now. Has been for years. Most of the good stores left around 2017, and the ones that stayed just never got the hint. Somehow there's still a Radio Shack down by the East Wing. Nobody knows how it's open. Even the guy who works there doesn't seem sure. The food court's half shut, and the Chinese place only makes food if you call ahead. The escalator breaks at least twice a week, and nobody bothers fixing it unless somebody complains. Still, the lights come on every night. Somebody has to walk the halls. That someone is me. I work alone most of the time. Jerry handles the day shift, but he clocks out before sundown and doesn't ask questions. I'm fine with that. My only real partner on the job is Benny. He's a 6-year-old mutt with a good nose, a twitchy tail, and more common sense than most people I know. He walks every round with me, tail up, ears forward, always focused. I bought him a little police dog vest online as a joke, but he wears it like it's part of the uniform. People see him and smile, but I've learned to pay attention when he stops smiling. He takes the job seriously, even when I don't. The first time I saw kids playing the mall game was back in July. It was summer break, and they were bored. Most of them didn't even live nearby. They showed up in groups of 3 or 4, usually with a phone out and someone narrating in that fake, scary voice people use online. I caught him on camera slipping through a maintenance door that never locked right. First, I thought they were just filming, one of those abandoned mall walkthroughs. No big deal. But then they started coming back. Different kids, same behavior, moving in the same directions, touching the same doors, sitting in the same chairs and the same food court booths. They weren't just exploring, they were following instructions. I didn't understand it right away, but it felt too coordinated to be random. After a couple weeks, I stopped one of them and asked what the hell they were doing. He was maybe 16. Hoodie, flashlight, sneakers that lit up when he walked. He was very nervous, but actually polite. Said it was just a challenge. Something from TikTok. Said there were rules, and if you followed them, you could win. I asked what this meant. Win what? He said he didn't know. Just that if you followed the rules exactly, something weird might happen. I asked what the rules were. He rattled some off from memory, then showed me the full list on his phone. And that's when I realized this wasn't some prank. There were a lot of them. Numbered. Repeated online by dozens of accounts. Some rules matched. Some didn't. but enough were the same. So I started writing them down. Alright, well, rule 1. It's called the walk. It's how all of them start the game. The kids, I mean. Every version I've come across begins with this step. They show up sometime before 1 a.m. and wait outside one of the main entrances. That could be the east wing, the west wing, or the food court side. Doesn't matter which one, as long as it's one of the 3 front-facing doors. Back entrances, staff hallways, or side exits don't count. They all say the same thing. It has to be a main entrance, and it has to be exactly 1 a.m. The time seems very important to them. I've heard them say that's when the mall switches over, though no one's ever been clear on what that means. Some of them just repeat it like a rule, like something they read online but didn't question. I've looked through the security system logs. Sometimes around that hour, cameras glitch, lights flicker, or systems reset without warning. Doesn't happen every night, but often enough that I started paying attention. According to the kids, the walk is a focus test. The goal is to walk from the entrance straight to the central fountain. No stopping, no detours, and no looking into the store windows. That last part is the main rule. You're allowed to blink, shift your eyes a little, but you're not supposed to turn your head or glance into any display window along the way. If you do, you're out. You fail the walk. They act like it's a game of discipline, something to prove they can follow instructions. A few treat it like a challenge they can post online. Some even rate each other on how well they stayed focused or how far they got before messing up. Most of it's just talk, but I've watched enough of them try it now to know that the rule isn't just about focus. There's a reason you're not supposed to look. The storefront displays, they're not the same at night. I've worked here long enough to notice which stores leave their lights on and what their windows usually look like. After 1 a.m., some of those displays change. Stores that are empty during the day sometimes have mannequins inside at night. Other displays show doors open that should be locked. Sometimes the lights are off, but there's still something standing behind the glass. The mannequins move. It's small movements. They're not jumping out or shifting fast, but they don't stay put. This one night, I walked past the window of an old women's clothing store. It was empty earlier that week. When I came through that hallway after 1 a.m., there were 4 mannequins lined up at the front of the display. By the time I passed again during my next round, one of them had turned to face the glass. And that kind of thing happens often. I've seen a kid stand in front of a display and just freeze there. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared into the glass for too long. When I got his attention and asked what he saw, he said the mannequin inside had stepped forward. I checked the camera footage afterward. The feed was frozen during that time. Nothing recorded. Another night, I pulled 2 kids away from a window near the old jewelry store. They were standing too close. One of them had their phone up, filming. I saw what was behind the glass. A mannequin pressed up with its hand flat against it, like it'd been mid-step when they stopped to look. That display hadn't had anything in it the day before. Sometimes Benny notices them before I do. He'll stop walking and go real quiet. Not growling, not barking. Just still, tail stiff, eyes locked on something I can't see from my angle. Usually it's one of those windows. I don't ask questions when he does that. I just move along and call him after me. He always follows, but he doesn't take his eyes off the display until we're out of that hallway. The kids don't take any of it serious. They talk about points and rounds and beating the walk, like there's some kind of prize at the end. But the way I see it, the walk isn't testing them. It's watching to see who's paying attention. The second someone looks into the glass, they're not just breaking a rule, they're making contact with something inside. If you reach the fountain without looking into the windows, the game says you pass. You're allowed to move on to the next part. If you fail, you're supposed to leave the mall right away and try again another night. Most kids don't take it that seriously. They mess around, get bored, and head out. But I have seen a few who don't. One boy disappeared from the cameras after failing the walk. His friends said he wanted to keep going anyway. We found him in the west stairwell 2 hours later, just sitting on the floor. He wouldn't say anything. He didn't respond when the paramedics arrived. He didn't even blink until they carried him out. Another kid ended up 10 miles away, wandering barefoot into a gas station at dawn. He couldn't explain how he got there. He told the officer he had taken a wrong turn somewhere behind the fountain, and that part of the mall has no back exit. So that's rule 1. Walk from the entrance to the fountain at exactly 1 a.m. Don't stop, don't speak, and don't look into the windows. Rule 2. Rule 2 is called the Echo Challenge. This step comes right after the kids finish Rule 1. If they reach the central fountain without breaking the first rule, the game tells them to head to the south wing. That hallway is on the far side of the mall, past the old pet store and the closed vitamin shop. It leads toward the freight elevator, and what used to be the main employee service hallway when the mall was fully staffed. Once the player reaches the middle of that hallway, they're supposed to clap 1 time. Just once. The kids treat it like a signal for the next level. Some of them say it wakes up the mall for the next step. Others say it triggers the next challenge. There's no real explanation. They just repeat what they hear online. The rule says that if the clap comes back with a clean echo, same timing, same tone, then they pass and can move to Rule 3. If the echo takes too long or comes back sounding different, then they're supposed to stop immediately and leave the mall before 1:10 a.m. That part gets ignored a lot. The problem is that the south wing reacts to sound at night. I don't know the reason, and I've never seen a person down there after hours, but I have heard things move around in that wing, like heavy items dragging on the floor. I hear it during rounds sometimes. It's not every night, but when it happens, it always lines up with the same time, between 1:04 a.m. and 1:12 a.m. Benny refuses to go near that hallway no matter what time it is. He'll walk with me anywhere else in this mall, but not there. The south wing, it's also older than the rest of the building. When the mall was first designed, that hallway was supposed to connect to a second expansion that never happened. Construction began in the early 2000s, but there was a fire during the build-out. Wasn't publicized much, but a few employees working overnight were killed. The official story blamed faulty wiring, and cleanup started right away. They kept building for a little while after that, but the project was shut down not long after, unofficially. A bigger issue is the backroom doors in that area. The mall has several service corridors that run behind the storefronts. Most of them are locked, but the ones in the south wing have been opening on their own. I found them cracked open on nights when I know I checked them earlier. And whenever this happens, it's always around the same time, right after a group of teens try to play the mall game. And this brings us to the case you asked about earlier. The kid they found in the water tank on the roof. Yeah, that was Caleb Meyer. 14 years old. Came in with his older brother and 2 friends on August 19th. I wasn't near the entrances at the time, but I saw all of them on the security footage later. before handing the tapes to the police. They entered through the food court doors at 12:56 a.m. Caleb was wearing a red hoodie, and the brother had a backpack. They stopped at the fountain like the game tells them to. It was around 1:03 a.m. when they got there. They talked for a bit, and then Caleb and his brother started walking toward the south wing. The other two stayed behind. That's not unusual. Sometimes kids split up when they want to film different parts of the challenge. The cameras recorded them entering the hallway at 1:06 a.m. At 1:08 a.m., the footage shows only the brother coming back. He turned around, walked a few steps backward, said something out of view, and then came back alone. He rejoined the others, and they all left the mall by 1:11 a.m. They didn't report Caleb missing until the next morning when he didn't come home. When officers questioned the brother, he said they both clapped just like the rules said. His echo came back right away, but Caleb's didn't. The brother described it as slow and uneven. He said it sounded like it bounced off a room that wasn't supposed to be there. He told Caleb they should head back, but Caleb said he wanted to check something real quick. He walked deeper into the hallway, and the brother left him there. 9 days later, maintenance workers noticed complaints from the shop owners about the tap water. When they checked the rooftop tank, they found Caleb inside, dead. The tank hatch was closed. The maintenance staff had to cut the lock to open it. The ladder inside the tank wasn't extended, and the access door leading to the roof didn't show signs of forced entry. He didn't have any broken bones, and there weren't marks that suggested he'd been in a fight. But there was an open wound on his abdomen that the coroner couldn't explain. And his liver was missing. His clothes were folded beside the tank, as if he'd taken his time arranging them. His shoes and socks were placed neatly next to the pile, lined up instead of kicked off. They didn't find his phone or his wallet. All I can tell you is that the hallway he walked into has a backroom door that connects to the service corridors. That door was found open that same night. I saw it myself. I used my own key to lock it again. I think Caleb made the mistake of hearing the wrong echo and staying anyway. Whatever answered him wasn't supposed to. And that's all I know about Rule 2 in that particular case, Detective. But there's 2 more rules that you should know about. Rule 3 is called Ride the Elevator. This is the step where things usually go wrong. If a kid makes it through the first 2 parts, the walk and the echo, then the next move is to go to the central elevator, not the service lift in the back, not the one near the food court. It has to be the main one in the middle of the mall, right next to the fountain. It's old, the panel inside scratched up. The lighting above it is dim, and sometimes the floor indicators don't light up at all. Still works though. Maintenance checks it once a month, and I've ridden it hundreds of times. Normally, it takes you to 3 places: the ground floor, the second floor, and the underground parking garage. That underground level is labeled C1 for Car Park 1. That's the only underground level the mall was supposed to have, at least officially. According to the kids who play the mall game, that elevator behaves very differently after 1 a.m. But only if you followed the first 2 steps exactly. If you mess one of them up, it just works like normal. But if you do everything right, they say the elevator will flicker when you press C1. Sometimes the button flashes twice. Sometimes it lights up, then shuts off, then lights up again. They call that the signal, like a confirmation that the game is still going. The goal is to ride the elevator all the way down to the parking garage. They say the ride takes longer than it should. The distance from the main floor to C1 is only 1 level, maybe 10 or 15 seconds. but the kids report staying inside for up to a full minute. Some say it feels longer than that. A few have filmed themselves standing inside, waiting, just to prove how long it takes. The elevator has no music, just that mechanical hum. They usually record their faces in the ceiling corner, using their phone cameras to catch their own expressions. I've seen those videos. Most get deleted or flagged. The ones that stay up just show them waiting. The footage usually ends when the doors open. They expect something scary, like a spooky parking garage. Some lights flickering, maybe something far away in the dark. That's what they come in hoping for. Something thrilling. Something that gives them a good reaction clip. But that's not what this step is. When the elevator reaches the bottom, it's not always C1 anymore. I've been in that elevator during the day. I've ridden it to check reports, test the panel, or take deliveries to the lower garage. During normal hours, the only options on the panel are G, 2, and C1. That's it. No surprises, nothing weird. But after 1 a.m., and only on certain nights, more buttons appear. I've seen them myself. Buttons labeled 01, 02, and 03. I've asked maintenance about it, and they say those levels don't exist. The elevator system isn't coded for more than one basement level. No blueprints include a second or third subfloor. Nothing in the electrical room shows power routed that far down. But I have seen those buttons with my own eyes, and so have the kids. The stories vary depending on who you ask. Some say pressing 01 takes you to an old, forgotten part of the mall that was buried when they redid the foundation. Others say pressing 02 or 03 brings you to something worse. A few online say that's the part where you go to hell, but most just call it the next step in the challenge. I've never pressed those buttons. I won't, but I've talked to people who did. At least the ones who came back. A couple of teens I stopped one morning said they made it all the way to level 01. They said the elevator opened to a hallway with yellow wallpaper and water up to their ankles. They didn't go far in. One of them said it felt like something horrible was just around the corner. A feeling they couldn't explain that eventually forced them to wade back to the still open elevator. I've heard the reports. The missing kids. I think Rule 3 is when most of them disappear or go missing. They step into that elevator, press a button, and the doors open to something they weren't ready for. After that, there's no camera footage. The elevator returns empty, sometimes after a delay. The button panel is back to normal when I check it. I have had to call more than one set of parents. I've looked through the footage. There's no struggle, no signs of panic, no alarms go off. They just ride the elevator down, the doors open, and that's it. They're gone. I don't know if it takes them to hell. I don't know if I believe in all that. But I do think it takes them somewhere they weren't supposed to go. Somewhere beneath a mall that isn't mapped, built, or maintained by anyone still working here. I think those extra floors are part of the same system the back rooms are connected to. The ones that open up when the south wing is active. Whatever's down there, it isn't empty. There's one more rule. Rule 4. I call it follow the dog, and it's the only rule that can actually save someone. Before I explain it, I need to be direct with you, because you're a detective, and you asked for the truth. There's something inside this mall. It lives in the back rooms, the service tunnels, sealed hallways, and unmapped basement levels that shouldn't exist. It's the reason the displays shift. It's the reason the south wing acts the way it does. It's the reason the elevator goes places it shouldn't. And it follows the kids. Not all the time. Not every night. But when they get too far into the game, when they ignore warnings, stay past the time limit, or press the wrong button, that thing finds them. It moves quietly, and it's patient. When it gets close, the air changes in a way people don't notice at first. You feel pressure, or maybe just the sense that something is standing too close. Kids think it's nerves. It's not. The autopsies never get released publicly, but I have seen the reports for 2 of the missing kids you mentioned earlier. Both have the same thing in common: clean abdominal wounds and missing livers. No struggle marks. No trauma consistent with a fall or impact. Just that one detail. Do I think the monster eats kids? Not exactly. But it hunts them. And it eats certain body parts. Then it leaves the rest. That lines up with what I've seen in the hallways. Not directly. I've never seen that thing in full. I don't know what that thing really looks like. But Benny does. He's not trained for this, and I've never taught him anything special. But he's been with me long enough that he recognizes when that thing is nearby. He hears it before I do. He senses it when it slips between the unfinished walls or moves through the locked service corridors. Every single time that creature gets close to someone, close enough that the kid is about to do something stupid, like take a step into the wrong room, Benny is there first. He puts himself between them and whatever is behind them. Kids think he's part of the game. They see a dog show up in the middle of something spooky, and they assume he's a hint or a guide. They call out to him. They try to follow him deeper into the mall because they think they unlocked a secret stage. There's nothing special about it. Benny goes to them because the monster is very close. Last December, 3 boys snuck in through the service door behind the gym. They were loud, not scared at all. One of them was live streaming it, telling his chat he was about to do Rule 3. I watched them cut across the corridor from the camera feed. I started heading toward him, but Benny was faster. By the time I reached the south wing entrance, Benny was already standing in front of the boys, ears forward, not wagging or excited, just alert. He was looking past them down the hallway. The 3 kids thought it was funny. One bent down and tried to pet him. The kid behind him pulled out his phone and said, "Whoa, is this a bonus round?" I got there just in time to stop them from walking any further. When I turned to look where Benny was facing, I saw something shift in the shadows of the unfinished hallway behind the old vitamin shop. It pulled back the moment Benny growled. Whatever that thing is. I think it's scared of dogs. If he hadn't found him, those boys would have kept going. Another time, this was last spring, a girl was trying to record the elevator part of the game. We were on the elevator with her when she quickly pressed C1, and the door didn't open to the right floor. The hallway she stepped into wasn't part of the mall I knew. It had pipes on the ceiling and a long line of dark concrete rooms with no numbers. She thought it was the secret basement level, so she quickly stepped out with her phone held high. Benny sprinted past me the moment the elevator opened. He shoved himself between her and the hallway, barking hard enough to echo. She froze, and then the lights down that hallway, the ones I didn't know, started shutting off, one after another, each click louder than the last. Something was walking in the darkness,
coming toward us. She backed into the elevator, and I slammed the door close button. We didn't talk for the rest of the ride. And that's why I tell people this rule plainly. No metaphors, no jokes. If the dog finds you, the game is over. Follow him out, or you won't leave at all. Kids don't understand how the mall behaves when someone gets too far into the game. They think the flickering lights and the changing hallways are all scripted to scare them. They don't realize the mall is helping it move. They don't notice when it funnels them toward the exact two places they should never go: the South Wing and the unmapped basement levels. The South Wing connects to the back rooms, and the back rooms are where that thing lives. That's where the half-finished hallways are. That's where the sealed fire doors open by themselves. That's where the fire happened years ago. The one they blamed on faulty wiring, even though the workers' bodies were found in positions that didn't match smoke inhalation. People say the expansion stopped because of that. They say the blueprints were shredded on purpose, and nobody talks about it anymore. As for the basement levels, the elevator shouldn't even reach them. But when someone plays the game right, the mall opens paths that aren't supposed to exist. And when someone steps through those paths, that thing follows. And that's why Benny is the last rule. He is the only warning you get. If he finds you, don't film him. Just follow him. Immediately. More often than not, animals know something we don't. And that's everything. Every rule, every sighting, at least most of them, every kid I had to walk out by the arm, shaking and silent. I've told you what I've seen, and what I've pulled from the logbooks, the broken cameras, and whatever the mall didn't swallow whole. You asked me for the truth, or something close to it, and that's what you got. There isn't more to explain, not really. Some nights I still hear footsteps where there shouldn't be any. Sometimes I catch glimpses on monitors that don't record. Sometimes Benny growls at nothing for a little too long. But that's just the job now. We'll be sticking around, me and Benny. Same uniform, same loop, same elevator that still thinks there's a floor beneath the parking garage. Someone has to keep the kids from pressing the wrong button. I'm not sure what's going to become of this place. Are they going to tear it down? Seems like there might be a chance of that, considering we got you detectives sniffing around the place. But nah, I know the county mayor. He keeps this joint running even if it cost him a few kids. That's how he thinks. Probably tells himself none of this is real and that all the disappearances aren't connected. Benny and I will just have to keep doing our jobs, saving as many as we can. As for you, you've got a badge, you've got a folder full of missing persons reports, you've got enough to file something, push it up the chain, maybe even get a meeting scheduled, who knows. But let's be honest, you've seen the same footage I have. You've read the statements. You know there's no one you can hand this to who will believe any of it. So here's what I'll say. You don't need to believe all of it. You don't need to write it down word for word. But the next time someone brings you a case that leads back to this place, and they will, I want you to remember what I told you. If you ever come back after dark, for whatever reason, bring a flashlight, stay out of the South Wing, and don't get on that elevator if it's already open.